It's a strange question to ponder here in the quiet of the night. But why does the best technology sometimes lose? We imagine history as a simple upward climb from good to better to best. But the story of how iron replaced bronze is far more complicated and, frankly, a little baffling. For centuries, bronze was the undisputed king of metals. It was strong, easy to cast, corrosion resistant, and beautiful, a shimmering golden alloy for the swords of heroes and the mirrors of queens. Early iron, by contrast, was a pathetic usurper. It was brittle, difficult to work, and rusted at the mere suggestion of moisture. A well-made bronze sword could shatter a primitive iron one. So why did this ugly, unreliable metal completely take over the worlds? The truth is, iron didn't win because it was better. It won because the world that made bronze possible had utterly, catastrophically fallen apart. It's a story not of innovation, but of desperation. A story of survivors picking through the rubble of a fallen golden age, forced to make do with a gritty, difficult, but ultimately democratic metal they could find in their own backyards. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As our story unfolds across the globe tonight, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Go ahead and drop your city or country in the comments below, creating a small map of our shared quiet time. Now, let the world around you fade away as we drift back, not just in time, but to a time just before the beginning. Let's imagine the world around the year 1250 BCE. It is a place of glittering empires, a world connected by sea lanes and caravan tracks, humming with a level of international trade it wouldn't see again for over 1,000 years. This is the very height of the late Bronze Age. In Egypt, the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom rule from their magnificent temples at Thebes, their scribes sending carefully worded diplomatic letters on clay tablets to their fellow kings across the sea. In the rocky highlands of Anatolia, what is now modern-day Turkey, the formidable Hittite Empire presides, its armies of chariots a fearsome sight, its capital city of Hattusa a wonder of fortifications. And across the Aegean, on the Greek mainland and the island of Crete, the Mycenaeans are building their colossal citadel palaces, their kings buried with golden death masks, their ships trading oil and wine across the entirety of the Mediterranean. These great powers are rivals, certainly, but they are also partners in a complex globalized system. They trade, they marry their children to one another, they write polite letters asking for shipments of copper or the services of a skilled physician. It is a world of surprising interconnectedness, and it is all built on bronze. And bronze, you see, has a crucial vulnerability. It is an alloy, a recipe of two different metals, mostly copper, with a vital dash of tin. Copper is fairly common, but tin is geographically rare, found in only a few scattered places on Earth. The tin that supplied this entire glittering world had to be mined in the distant mountains of Afghanistan, or perhaps even as far away as Cornwall in Britain, and then hauled thousands of miles by donkey and by boat to the great palace workshops of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. The entire magnificent structure of the late Bronze Age, its armies, its art, its tools, its very identity, depended entirely on these fragile, 1,000-mile-long supply chains for that one critical ingredient. For a time, the system worked beautifully. The tin flowed, the copper was mined, and the bronze smiths created wonders. The world felt stable, eternal, golden. And then, in the space of a single generation, it all came crashing down. Beginning around 1200 BCE, a wave of destruction swept across this vibrant, interconnected world with a speed and finality that is still shocking to historians today. One by one, the great cities burned. In Greece, the mighty Mycenaean citadels of Pylos and Mycenae were violently destroyed and abandoned, their complex writing system, Linear B, vanishing forever. In Anatolia, the immense Hittite capital of Hattusa was sacked and torched, and the entire empire dissolved into memory. Along the Levantine coast, the bustling port city of Ugarit was razed, its kilns still filled with the last batch of pottery, its destruction so sudden that a final, desperate diplomatic letter was found still in the oven where it was being fired. Egypt survived, but just barely. Its own records speak of fending off repeated invasions from a mysterious coalition of attackers they called the Sea Peoples. Pharaoh Rameses III inscribed his desperate victories on his temple walls, but the world he saved was a shadow of its former self. Egypt retreated into isolation, its empire gone, its foreign contacts severed. The sheer scale of the collapse is difficult to comprehend. It wasn't just a war or a famine. It was a near-total societal disintegration across thousands of square miles. Literacy vanished in many regions. Population levels plummeted. The intricate web of trade that had been the lifeblood of the era was completely shredded. The palaces, which had acted as the central hubs for production and redistribution, were gone, and with their destruction, the long-distance trade routes for tin simply ceased to exist. You could no longer place an order with a sea captain for a shipment of tin from the Far East. There were no sea captains, no Far East to trade with, and no centralized palace to place the order. This is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. For a century, archaeologists and historians have debated what could have caused such a widespread and simultaneous catastrophe. Was it the Sea Peoples mentioned by the Egyptians? Were they a wave of migrating pirates whose raids shattered the stability of the sea lanes? It's a compelling theory, but many now believe these raiders were more a symptom of the collapse than its cause, desperate refugees and opportunistic marauders taking advantage of a system already in crisis. Another powerful theory points to climate change. Evidence from ancient pollen, lake beds, and cave stalagmites suggests that this period saw the onset of a centuries-long megadrought. Widespread crop failures would have led to famine, which in turn would have caused peasant uprisings, mass migrations, and resource wars, destabilizing the great empires from within. A more recent hypothesis is the idea of a systems collapse. The late Bronze Age world, much like our own, was so specialized and interdependent that it was dangerously fragile. A disruption in one part of the system, a drought, a rebellion, a pirate raid, could set off a cascading chain of failures that brought the whole edifice down. The truth is likely some combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of disaster. But for the scattered survivors in this broken world, the academic debate was meaningless. All they knew was that the palaces were empty, the ships were not coming, and the world they had known was gone. The global supply chain was dead, and that meant the recipe for bronze could no longer be filled. A local king or chieftain could no longer make the tools and weapons he needed to farm, to build, or to defend himself. The age of bronze was over, not by choice, but by necessity. It left behind a power vacuum, a technological void, and a desperate need for a replacement. Any replacement that could be sourced not from across a dead sea, but from the very earth beneath their feet. In that shattered world, with the sea lanes silent and the great tin mines of the East lost to myth, a desperate search began, not for something new, but for a substitute. For generations, iron had existed on the absolute fringes of society, a metal far rarer and more precious than gold. This wasn't the common, rust-prone stuff we know today. This was a metal of the gods, quite literally. The earliest iron objects known to humanity were not smelted from the earth, but painstakingly hammered from meteorites that had fallen from the sky. The ancient Sumerians called it anbar, heaven metal, and the Egyptians believed it was the very material that formed the bones of the deities. When the boy king Tutankhamun was laid to rest, alongside his golden chariots and lapis lazuli jewelry, he was given 2 daggers. One was of gold, a symbol of earthly wealth. The other, its blade still sharp after 3,000 years in the tomb, was of meteoric iron, a treasure of almost unimaginable value, a piece of the cosmos to carry into the afterlife. This was iron as a celestial jewel, a rare curiosity for kings, not a practical material for the masses. But even as the Bronze Age empires flourished, one of them, nestled in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, had begun to unlock the earthly secret of this strange metal. This was the Hittite Empire. Before the Great Collapse turned their mighty civilization to dust, the Hittites had established themselves as one of the 3 great superpowers of the age, alongside Egypt and Assyria. Their homeland was a geologist's paradise, rich in copper, silver, and crucially, iron ore. While their neighbors were perfecting the art of bronze, a few Hittite smiths were engaged in a far more difficult and magical kind of alchemy. They were trying to coax the heaven metal not from the sky, but from the reddish, crumbly rocks that littered their hillsides. This was a monumental technological challenge, because iron is nothing like copper or tin. Working with bronze is akin to being a baker. You can melt copper and tin together in a crucible, a ceramic pot, in a furnace that gets reasonably hot. The resulting liquid bronze can then be poured into stone or clay molds to create an almost finished object, whether a sword, a helmet, or a delicate statuette. It's a process of melting and casting, one that is predictable and scalable. Iron, however, is a different beast entirely. Its melting point is extraordinarily high, nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature far beyond the capabilities of any Bronze Age furnace. You simply could not melt it. The Hittite smiths had to invent a completely new, counterintuitive process. They had to persuade the iron to emerge from the rock without ever becoming a liquid. The device they engineered was the bloomery furnace, a simple but ingenious chimney-like structure made of clay, often built into the side of a hill to take advantage of the natural draft. Into this furnace, a smith would load alternating layers of 2 simple ingredients: charcoal made from hardwood and crushed iron ore, which often just looked like reddish-brown dirt. For hours upon agonizing hours, they would work the bellows, pumping air into the furnace to make the charcoal burn as hot as humanly possible. The air would fill with the sharp scent of burning wood and hot stone. Inside the furnace, a strange transformations occurred. The intense heat and the carbon monoxide gas from the burning charcoal stripped the oxygen away from the iron ore, reducing the rock back into metal. But it was not liquid metal. Instead, what collected at the bottom of the furnace was a spongy, porous mass of iron mixed with all sorts of melted, glassy impurities called slag. This ugly, glowing lump was known as a bloom, and the work had only just begun. This bloom was all but useless as it was. The real magic and the real labor happened at the forge. The smith and his apprentices would haul the glowing bloom from the furnace, and while it was still incandescent, begin hammering it relentlessly. With every deafening strike of the hammer, molten slag would spray out like fireworks, and the porous iron would slowly be compacted and welded together. This was not casting. This was forging. It was a brutal, physically demanding, and highly skilled art. The smith had to know just when to strike, how hard, and in which direction, to shape the metal and expel the impurities. After countless cycles of reheating and hammering, he might finally produce a single solid bar of usable iron, or what we would call wrought iron. Given this laborious and uncertain process, it's no surprise that iron objects remained rare even within the Hittite Empire. But it seems the Hittite kings understood the potential of what their smiths had achieved. They treated the knowledge of iron production as a matter of state security. We have a tantalizing glimpse into this world of high-stakes metallurgical secrecy from a single clay tablet, a letter sent from the Hittite king Hattusili III to a rival king in Assyria sometime in the 13th century BCE. The Assyrian king had apparently written to request a shipment of iron. Hattusili's reply is a masterpiece of diplomatic doublespeak. He writes, "In the matter of the good iron which you wrote to me about, good iron is not available in my seal house in Kizuwatna. That it is a bad time for producing iron I have written. He makes excuses. He says the warehouses are empty." Then, as a gesture of goodwill, he adds that he is sending a single iron dagger blade as a gift and promises to make more iron for the Assyrian king later, though he makes it clear it won't be soon. Was he telling the truth? Was it genuinely a bad season for iron production, perhaps due to a shortage of charcoal? Or was this the ancient equivalent of telling a rival nation that your advanced military technology is not available for export? For a long time, historians believed this letter was proof of a deliberate Hittite monopoly, that they were jealously guarding the secret of iron like a modern superpower guards its nuclear codes. The more likely truth lies somewhere in between. The process was so difficult and resource intensive that they probably couldn't mass produce iron on demand, but they also surely recognized its immense strategic value and were in no hurry to share their hard-won knowledge with the very people their armies might one day have to face. Then came the collapse. When the Hittite capital burned and the empire dissolved, this carefully guarded secret was blown to the four winds. The highly specialized iron smiths of the king's workshops were now refugees. They fled the chaos, carrying no gold and no property, but possessing something far more valuable: the knowledge held in their minds and the skill in their hands. These anonymous, itinerant craftsmen spread throughout the Near East, seeking new patrons. They would have sold their services to anyone who could provide them with a forge, charcoal, and security, a local Canaanite warlord, a Philistine chieftain, a Syrian merchant. The state secret of the mighty Hittite Empire became the open source technology of a dark and shattered age. The knowledge was now free, available to anyone who had the need, the resources, and the will to hammer a new world into existence from the dirt and the fire. And so, the knowledge began to seep into the cracks of the broken world. Imagine a refugee blacksmith, a man who once worked in the roaring forges of the Hittite capital, now trudging along a dusty track in Syria or Canaan. He carries with him no great wealth, only the memory of fire and a deep, intuitive understanding of how to read the color of hot metal. He arrives at a small, fortified hilltop village, a place ruled by a local chieftain whose only connection to the glorious past is a single, chipped bronze spearhead passed down from his grandfather. The trade routes are dead, the great kings are all gone, and for this chieftain, metal is now scarcer than food. The smith makes a bold promise. He points to the reddish rocks on a nearby hillside and says he can make swords and plowshares from that common dirt. It must have sounded like a madman's boast or a magician's trick, but in an age of desperation, any hope was worth entertaining. The chieftain would have set the strange smith up with a place to work, assigned villagers to haul ore and burn wood for charcoal. And after days of sweat and smoke, the first piece of local iron would have emerged from the fire, and very likely the chieftain would have been thoroughly unimpressed, because the great irony of the beginning of the Iron Age is that early iron was, for the most part, objectively terrible. It was a significant downgrade from the high-quality bronze that had defined the previous era. A well-made bronze sword, crafted by a master smith from the correct alloy of copper and tin, was a remarkable piece of technology. It was strong, flexible, and held a keen edge. By hammering the edge of the blade, a smith could work harden it, making it even more durable, and because it was cast in a mold, the quality was consistent. You knew exactly what you were getting. The first iron tools, however, were plagued with problems. The wrought iron produced in the bloomery furnace was often riddled with hidden pockets of slag that the smith had failed to hammer out, creating weak points where a blade might snap under pressure. Worse still, this early iron was soft. It was almost pure iron, which on its own is a rather pliable metal. It didn't hold an edge nearly as well as good bronze. A warrior in the heat of battle might strike a shield and find his new iron sword had bent into a useless curve, forcing him to frantically try and straighten it with his foot before the next blow fell. An ignominious scene that was actually described by later Roman historians observing Celtic warriors. The secret that the ancient smiths didn't understand, the one that would eventually make iron the undisputed master of all metals, was carbon. The tiny, almost magical difference between soft, bendable iron and hard, sharp steel is the addition of a very small amount of carbon. In the bloomery furnace, the iron ore was in constant contact with the burning charcoal, which is a source of carbon. By sheer luck, the outer surface of an iron bloom might absorb some of that carbon, a process we call carburization. If a smith happened to forge a sword from this accidentally carburized outer layer, he would create a blade with a steel edge. It would be a weapon of astonishing quality, harder and sharper than any bronze. But to that smith, it would have seemed like a miraculous fluke. He wouldn't have understood the chemistry, the invisible infusion of carbon. He would have attributed it to a good omen, a particularly hot fire, or the blessings of the gods. He could not reliably replicate it. For every one legendary steel blade he produced by accident, he would produce 100 mediocre iron ones. Bronze, by contrast, offered no such miraculous surprises, but it also promised no disappointing failures. It was reliably, predictably good. So we return to the central puzzle. If this new material was so inconsistent, so prone to bending, and generally so much worse than the metal it was replacing, why did it catch on at all? The answer has nothing to do with quality and everything to do with economics and geography. The first and most important reason was simple availability. As we saw, the ingredients for bronze, copper, and especially tin were rare and required complex international trade networks. The ingredients for iron, on the other hand, are two of the most abundant things on the planet: iron ore and wood for charcoal. Iron oxide is the fourth most common element in the Earth's crust. It is quite literally, in many places, the dirt under your feet. This was the game changer. In the post-collapse world, you no longer needed a king to organize a 1,000-mile trade expedition to get metal. A single village with a local source of bog iron or a rusty-looking hillside and a nearby forest for fuel could, in theory, become self-sufficient. Iron was the ultimate local resource. It was the difference between having a bad sword and having no sword at all. This leads to the second, more profound reason. Iron was a democratic metal. Bronze had been an aristocratic material. Its production was controlled by the great palaces, its use restricted to the king's elite chariot corps and the wealthy upper classes. It was a top-down technology. Iron was the opposite. It was a grassroots, bottom-up revolution. Any small-time chieftain or even a moderately prosperous village could now aspire to equip its own militia. Any farmer could hope to one day own an iron plowshare, a tool that had been an impossible luxury in the Bronze Age. This shift in access to metal would have immense social and political consequences. It would empower smaller states and local warlords, upsetting the old balance of power forever. Finally, while early iron was poor, it held a tantalizing promise of potential. Bronze was a perfected, mature technology. A bronze sword made in 1100 BCE was not significantly better than one made in 1600 BCE. The material had reached its peak. Iron, however, was a technology in its infancy. Its very inconsistency was a source of endless fascination for the blacksmiths who worked it. That one miraculous blade in 100 that was better than anything made of bronze proved that there were secrets left to uncover. It drove generations of smiths to experiment, to try different ores, different furnace designs, different quenching techniques, all in an effort to chase that elusive perfection. They were at the very beginning of a long, slow journey of discovery that would eventually lead to true steel. They were choosing a difficult material with a high ceiling for improvement over a simple material whose potential was already maxed out. They were choosing the future over the past, not because it was easier, but because in a hard new world, it was the only choice they had. This new age, built on local ingenuity and a stubborn, unglamorous metal, was born from the ashes of a world that had been comprehensively burned. And for centuries, the prime suspects for the arson were a mysterious group of villains known to history only by a name given to them by their victims, the Sea Peoples. To understand them, we must travel to the one great Bronze Age kingdom that withstood the tsunami of collapse, though it was left battered and clinging to the shore. We must go to Egypt. There, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, stands the vast mortuary temple of Ramesses III, a sprawling complex of pylons and courtyards known today as Medinet Habu. And on its stone walls, the pharaoh carved his masterpiece of propaganda, a story for the ages of how he alone saved civilization from a barbarian apocalypse. The inscriptions and reliefs at Medinet Habu are our only real window into this enigma, and it is a narrow and heavily biased one. They tell a dramatic story. From the north, from the very islands of the sea, a great conspiracy of peoples descended upon the known world. The Egyptians describe them not just as an army, but as a migrating horde, their warriors sailing in high-prowed ships, while their families followed in heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts. The carvings are vivid, filled with the chaos of battle. We see the Egyptian archers letting fly from the ramparts, the royal chariot of Ramesses III riding roughshod over his enemies, and a great naval battle in the Nile Delta, with Egyptian marines grappling with enemy ships, pulling them in to be slaughtered. The inscriptions are grim. No land could stand before their arms, the hieroglyphs declare, listing the great powers that were cut off and laid waste, including the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaeans. Egypt, the story goes, was the last bastion, the final levee holding back the flood. The carvings give us a ghostly lineup of these invaders, each with their own distinctive dress and weaponry. There are the Peliset, marching into battle wearing ornate feathered headdresses that look almost like a North American war bonnet. There are the Shurden, identifiable by their horned helmets and long, straight swords, a people who had previously served as elite mercenaries in the Egyptian army itself, now turned against their former masters. The temple walls name others too, each name a historical riddle: the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Denayan, the Cheker, the Weshesh. To the Egyptians, they were a single, terrifying force, but to us, they are a collection of historical phantoms. For over 150 years, scholars have been engaged in a grand detective game, trying to attach these Egyptian names to known places and peoples of the ancient world. It is a puzzle with many missing pieces. The most confident identification is that of the Peliset. They are almost universally believed to be the Philistines, who after their defeat by Ramesses, settled on the southern coast of Canaan. That strip of land would eventually be known to the Greeks as Palestine, a distant echo of the name of these feather-helmeted invaders. Some of the other connections are more speculative. The Shurden are often linked to the island of Sardinia, the Shekelesh to Sicily. The Denayan are sometimes tentatively identified with the Danaans, one of the names the poet Homer used for the ancient Greeks, leading to the theory that they were displaced Mycenaeans, fleeing their own burning citadels. The others remain complete blanks, their names floating in history, unmoored from any certain homeland. But the deeper mystery is not just who they were, but what they were doing. What could have motivated such a diverse coalition of peoples to leave their homes and throw themselves against the great empires of the age? One theory holds that they were simply a pirate confederacy, a loose alliance of sea raiders who sensed weakness in the old empires and banded together to plunder them. Yet this doesn't fully explain the ox carts and the families. They weren't just raiding, they were moving. This leads to another, more compelling theory that the sea peoples were actually refugees, the final domino in a catastrophic chain reaction. Perhaps the collapse began with a severe drought and famine in Greece or the Balkans, which sent the first wave of desperate migrants searching for new land. Their attacks on the Anatolian coast would have displaced the inhabitants there, turning them into the next wave of refugees, who in turn rolled south into Syria and the Levant, creating an ever-growing, rolling tide of the desperate and the dispossessed. In this view, the sea peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but its most tragic symptom. A more recent interpretation flips the narrative entirely. It suggests that the great empires were already rotting from within long before the first strange ships appeared on the horizon. Decades of drought, failing harvests, peasant rebellions, and internal political decay had fatally weakened them. The sea peoples in this light were merely opportunistic scavengers, picking over the corpse of a world that was already dead. They were the vultures, not the predators. They didn't cause the collapse. They were just the most visible sign that it was happening. Whatever their origin and ultimate motive, the impact of the sea peoples was undeniable. Their campaigns served as the final, violent severing of the old world's arteries. They were the agents of chaos who ensured that the intricate web of Bronze Age trade could not be repaired. They toppled regimes, burned cities, and disrupted the sea lanes so thoroughly that the flow of copper and tin ceased for good. In doing so, they inadvertently became the great catalysts of the Iron Age. They cleared the deck. They created a strategic vacuum where old powers vanished and new ones like the Philistines could arise. More importantly, they created a world of desperate necessity, a world where relying on foreign tin was no longer an option. They forced the scattered survivors of the Mediterranean to look inward, to find their resources locally, and to fully embrace the difficult, democratic, and ultimately world-changing technology of iron. The figures carved on the walls of Medinet Habu march on for eternity, frozen in the moment of their defeat. They are a monument to a forgotten war, but also to a profound historical truth. Sometimes, the forces that change the world are not great kings or brilliant inventors, but nameless, desperate people who rise from the sea, their true identities and motivations forever lost in the quiet dust of time. From that great, chaotic wave of sea peoples that broke against the shores of Egypt, one group in particular did not scatter back into the mists of the sea. The Paliset, those warriors with the distinctive feathered headdresses carved for eternity on the temple walls at Medinet Habu, were repelled but not destroyed. After their defeat by Rameses III, they retreated northward just a short distance up the coast and settled on the fertile coastal plain of southern Canaan. They put down roots. They took over the local cities and built new ones, and in this new land, they would become known to history as the Philistines. They were newcomers, a foreign implant in the ancient lands of the Levant, and they brought with them new customs, a new language, and a mastery of the new dark metal that would allow them to dominate their neighbors for generations. They established a powerful coalition of 5 city-states: the Philistine Pentapolis, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza along the coast, and Ekron and Gath further inland. These were not the crude camps of wandering marauders. They were sophisticated, well-planned urban centers. Archaeologists digging through their ruins have been struck by how different their culture was from the surrounding Canaanite peoples. Their pottery, in particular, looks westward. It is decorated with spirals and stylized birds, bearing a striking resemblance to the pottery of the Mycenaean and Aegean worlds, a powerful clue that these people were indeed transplanted Europeans, carrying the last embers of their collapsed Bronze Age civilization with them to a new home. They were, in a sense, the first colonists of a new age, and they arrived in a land that was ripe for the taking. The land of Canaan they entered was a political vacuum. The great Egyptian and Hittite empires that had long vied for control of this strategic land bridge had both receded, leaving behind a fractured landscape of small, squabbling Canaanite city-states. And up in the rugged, terraced highlands of the interior, a collection of pastoralist tribes was slowly coalescing into a new identity. These were the early Israelites. It was an environment of intense competition and low-level warfare, and into this mix, the Philistines introduced a powerful, disruptive new technology. Whether they brought the knowledge with them from their original homeland, or were simply the quickest and most organized group to employ the wandering Hittite smiths, the Philistines established the region's first true iron-based economy. The most dramatic account of this technological gap comes from the Hebrew Bible. In the first book of Samuel, the narrator describes the desperate state of the Israelites under Philistine pressure. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, the text claims, because the Philistines had said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. This passage paints a picture of a deliberate and total technological monopoly. It's a strategy of disarmament and control, where the Philistines not only possess the superior military hardware, but also control the means of agricultural production for their rivals. It portrays the Israelites as a technologically subjugated people, forced to rely on their oppressors for the most basic of metal tools. For a long time, this biblical account was taken as the literal truth. But the story told by the soil is, as is often the case, a little more nuanced and complex. Excavations at Philistine cities, particularly at Tel Kassil and Ekron, have unearthed the most extensive evidence of early iron industry in the entire Levant. Archaeologists have found the remains of numerous forges, heaps of iron slag, the glassy waste product of smelting, ceramic nozzles from bellows used to heat the fires, and a relative abundance of finished iron artifacts, knives, daggers, bracelets, and more. There is no doubt that the Philistine Pentapolis was the industrial heartland of the early Iron Age in Canaan. They were the masters of production. However, the archaeological record does not support a complete and total monopoly. Small numbers of iron objects from this same period have been found at Israelite sites in the highlands. The picture that emerges is not one of absolute control, but of a massive technological and industrial advantage. The Philistines had more smiths, and likely better ones. They had the organized urban society capable of sustaining a large-scale industry, managing the immense consumption of charcoal and the mining of ore. The Israelites, as a looser, more rural tribal society in the hills, were on the periphery of this new technology. They could get some iron, perhaps through trade or by capturing it, but they couldn't produce it on the same scale or with the same quality. It was less a case of the Philistines forbidding them from having smiths, and more a case of the Philistines simply being decades ahead on the technological curve. This industrial superiority had a clear military impact. The Philistines could field professional soldiers armed with iron swords and spears. They had chariots, a Bronze Age weapon of the flat plains, which they may have been updating with iron fittings for greater durability. This allowed them to dominate the fertile coastal plain and the major trade routes. The Israelites in the hills were at a disadvantage, their tribal militias using a hodgepodge of older bronze weapons and perhaps a few precious iron-bronze scale armor and an immense iron-tipped spear. He is the embodiment of the Philistine military-industrial complex, a walking tank, heavily armed with the products of a sophisticated and centralized urban forge. David, by contrast, is a shepherd from the hills. He rejects the traditional armor and weapons of organized warfare. He is mobile, unencumbered, and relies on the simple sling, a peasant's weapon, a tool of guerrilla fighters, perfectly suited to the hit-and-run tactics of the rugged hill country. His victory is the symbolic triumph of clever, asymmetric warfare over brute, heavily equipped force. But the power of the Philistines was not built on military might alone. The true engine of their prosperity was the iron plowshare, the ability to produce strong, durable iron tools on a large scale allowed them to more effectively cultivate the heavy, clay-rich soils of the coastal plain. Where a bronze or wooden plow might struggle or break, an iron one could carve a deep, clean furrow, unlocking far greater agricultural productivity. This led to food surpluses, which supported larger populations, craft specialization, and the growth of their wealthy cities. Their mastery of the forge fueled their farms as much as their armies, creating a robust economic foundation for their power. They were not just warriors, they were the first true pioneers of an iron-based society in the region, and it made them formidable. So let the scene settle in the quiet of your mind. Picture a blacksmith's workshop in the city of Ekron as dusk falls. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and hot metal. Inside, a smith, his face lit by the orange glow of the forge, raises his hammer over a luminous billet of iron. The ringing clang as metal strikes metal is the defining sound of this new era. It is not the sound of a palace workshop making a ceremonial mace for a distant king, but the sound of practical, widespread industry. It is the sound of a new power, born from the sea, forging its destiny. And for the tribes living in the quiet hills just a few miles to the east, it was a constant, rhythmic, and threatening reminder that the world had changed and that the age of iron had truly begun. Let us leave the ringing forges of the Philistines and travel west, across the dark, wine-colored sea, to a land that has fallen eerily quiet. Here, in the heartland of ancient Greece, the great collapse was not a blow, but a shattering. The world of the Mycenaeans, the world of Agamemnon and Achilles, of colossal citadel walls and golden death masks, had vanished as if it were a dream upon waking. The decades following 1200 BCE saw a period of such profound decline that for centuries historians have called it the Greek Dark Age. And while the name is dramatic, the evidence for it is stark and undeniable. The population of the Greek mainland may have plummeted by as much as 90%. The magnificent palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were not rebuilt. They were left as vast cyclopean ruins, their halls empty, their courtyards slowly being reclaimed by weeds and wildflowers. Life shrank dramatically. People abandoned the ruined centers and retreated into small, isolated, and impoverished villages, clinging to life in the hills or on remote coastlines. Grand art disappeared. The skills to build with massive hewn stones were lost. Most tellingly, the complex art of writing, the intricate linear B script used by the palace scribes to keep their meticulous records of taxes and trade, vanished completely. It was a tool for a complex bureaucracy, and with the bureaucracy gone, the tool became useless, its secrets forgotten for 3,000 years. The world became smaller, poorer, and illiterate. From the outside, it looked like a catastrophic, unrecoverable end. And yet, modern historians have begun to look at this period not as an ending, but as a necessary, if painful, new beginning. The term Dark Age is falling out of favor because it implies a cessation of progress, a time of ignorant stagnation. But the darkness was not in the minds of the people, it was simply in the archaeological record. What was lost was the glittering, top-heavy, and deeply oppressive palace system. The Mycenaean kings had ruled a rigid, feudal society where all wealth and production flowed to the center to be redistributed by the monarch. When that center collapsed, it was a disaster, but it was also a liberation. It wiped the slate clean. It was a brutal but essential pruning that allowed a new and very different kind of Greek society to grow in its place. Into this quiet, simplified world, iron technology began to arrive, not with a triumphant fanfare, but as a quiet trickle. As elsewhere, it was adopted from sheer necessity. The sea lanes to the east that had brought copper and tin were gone. The old bronze smiths had no raw materials. The new generation of smiths, learning their craft from contacts in Cyprus or the Levant, turned to the local iron deposits scattered throughout the Greek mainland. At first, iron was still a precious commodity, used more for its novelty and prestige than for its practical application. Early tombs from this period might contain a body adorned with bronze weapons, but the deceased might also have a few small, treasured iron rings on their fingers, or a single iron knife, a sign of wealth. The most common early iron objects were functional but simple. Long pins called fibulas used to fasten cloaks, simple daggers, and basic tools. The slow return of order and confidence can be traced in the one art form that never truly disappeared: pottery. After the collapse, the elaborate Mycenaean styles gave way to chaotic and messy local variations. But around 1050 BCE, a new style emerged, first in Athens, known as proto-geometric. It was a style of profound simplicity and order, the pots decorated with clean, sharp, concentric circles and semicircles, painted with a compass and brush. It was as if the potters were imposing a new, rational order on a chaotic world. Over the next 2 centuries, this evolved into the geometric style, where the entire surface of the pot was covered in intricate repeating patterns of zigzags, triangles, and the famous Greek key or meander. It is an art of discipline and mathematical precision, a quiet testament to a culture that was healing and thinking again. As the centuries of this supposed darkness wore on, iron became cheaper and more plentiful. Blacksmiths grew more skillful, their forges more efficient, and the slow, steady diffusion of iron began to fundamentally reshape society from the ground up. Iron axes and saws allowed for better woodworking and shipbuilding. Iron plowshares allowed farmers to cultivate the land more effectively, slowly increasing the food supply and allowing the population to recover. But its most profound impact was on warfare. The elite bronze-armored chariot warrior of the Mycenaean age was a relic. The new Greek warrior was the foot soldier. Iron was now cheap enough that a common farmer, a man who worked his own land, could afford to equip himself with an iron-tipped spear and perhaps a helmet. This democratization of warfare was the bedrock for a new political idea. When a community's defense no longer rests with a small, aristocratic elite, but with the entire body of its citizens, those citizens begin to demand a say in how the community is run. This was the seed of the polis, the Greek city-state. Power was no longer centralized in a king in his remote palace. It was now distributed among the land-owning farmer soldiers. These small, iron-equipped villages began to grow, trade, and band together. They built shared temples to their gods and established common meeting places, the agora, where they could gather to trade and make collective decisions. This was the slow, organic birth of Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth. The great institutions of the classical age, democracy, philosophy, theater, were all born from the political reality of the iron-wielding citizen soldier. The Dark Age, then, was not an end. It was the necessary crucible, the quiet, fertile ground in which the roots of Western civilization took hold. As the small villages of Greece were slowly, quietly rebuilding themselves with the humble tools of a new age, a very different story was unfolding to the north, beyond the mountains, in the vast, forested heart of Europe. While the Mediterranean world was recovering from the trauma of the Great Collapse, the peoples of Central Europe were embarking on their own Iron Age journey, one marked not by poverty and scarcity, but by staggering wealth, long-distance trade, and the rise of a powerful new aristocracy. This was the world of the Hallstatt culture, and its story begins not with a forge or a battlefield, but deep within an alpine mountain, in a quest for white gold. Let your mind drift to a stunningly beautiful place, a small village clinging to a mountainside, beside a placid, deep blue lake in what is now Austria. This is Hallstatt. For centuries, it was just a remote, picturesque town, but in the 19th century, a mine director began excavating a nearby cemetery and uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts that would rewrite the history of ancient Europe. The graves revealed that this tiny village had once been the center of a thriving and immensely wealthy society that flourished from roughly 800 to 450 BCE. And the source of that wealth was salt. The mountains looming over the lake concealed one of Europe's richest salt deposits, and the people of Hallstatt had been mining it since the Bronze Age. In a world without refrigeration, salt was a substance of almost magical power and immense value. It was essential for preserving meat and fish, allowing communities to store food through the long, hard winters. It was used for tanning leather, for medicinal purposes and was a vital part of the diet for both humans and their livestock. Control over a major source of salt was like controlling a modern-day oil field. The miners of Hallstatt tunneled deep into the mountainside, their way lit by the flickering orange glow of pine splinter torches. And thanks to the unique preserving properties of the salt itself, some of their lost tools and belongings have survived for nearly 3 millennia, giving us an intimate glimpse into their lives. Sturdy wooden pickaxes, leather backpacks for carrying the rock salt, fragments of woven wool clothing, even the preserved leftovers of a miner's lunch. This lucrative salt trade created a powerful and wealthy ruling class. These were not the kings of unified empires, but powerful local chieftains or princes who controlled the mines and the vital trade routes that transported the salt across the continent. They established themselves in heavily fortified settlements on strategic hilltops, known to German archaeologists as Fürstensitze, or princely seats. These were the political and economic capitals of their small territories. From behind their massive earth and timber ramparts, they would have presided over a bustling community of warriors, artisans, and farmers, their great halls filled with the sounds of feasting and the plots of politics. It is in their burials that we see the true extent of their wealth and connections. Unlike their late Bronze Age ancestors, the so-called Urnfield people who practiced cremation, these Hallstatt chieftains practiced lavish inhumation. They were laid to rest in large, timber-lined chambers dug into the earth, and then covered with a massive artificial hill of soil and rock, a burial mound or tumulus. These mounds, still visible as gentle, rounded hills in the European landscape today, were like vaults, preserving a snapshot of their owner's power and prestige. When archaeologists have carefully excavated these chambers, they have found a world of astonishing luxury. The deceased prince would often be placed upon a magnificent four-wheeled wagon or ceremonial cart, as if ready to ride into the afterlife. The wheels might be decorated with intricate metalwork, the carriage itself a masterpiece of woodworking. Around him would be placed the tools of his power and pleasure. This was a society that clearly valued the communal feast as a display of status, for the graves are filled with opulent feasting equipment. Huge bronze cauldrons capable of holding gallons of wine or mead, ornate drinking horns tipped with gold, and entire sets of painted pottery. And their weapons tell a fascinating story of technological transition. The most prestigious, high-status swords found in these graves are often still made of bronze, their hilts exquisitely crafted from ivory or inlaid with precious amber. This suggests that while iron was becoming the common material for everyday tools and the weapons of the average warrior, the old, golden-hued bronze was still the preferred metal for the elite to display their wealth and conservative, old-world glamour. These graves also reveal that the Hallstatt world was anything but isolated. They were the hubs of a vast European trade network. The amber in their sword hilts came from the distant shores of the Baltic Sea. The ivory was from African elephants, traded northwards by the Greeks and the Etruscans in Italy. Elaborate bronze vessels from Etruscan workshops and Greek wine-mixing bowls, or craters, show that these barbarian chieftains were connoisseurs of fine Mediterranean luxury goods, which they likely acquired in exchange for their salt, as well as for slaves, leather, and other northern commodities. So while the Greeks were slowly rebuilding their society from the village up, based on the democratic potential of the iron spear, the Hallstatt princes were creating a highly stratified aristocratic society. Their power was built on controlling a vital resource, and they used the wealth from that control to adorn themselves with the symbols of an older, more glamorous age. Iron was the humble, practical foundation of their world. It was the metal of the miners' picks and the farmers' plows, but the glittering superstructure of their power was still built on bronze, gold, and the control of the ancient, life-giving salt that lay deep within the earth. The world of the Hallstatt princes, with its rigid hierarchies and its taste for geometric patterns, was not destined to last. As the centuries passed, its foundations began to shift. The old trade routes changed, the power of the salt mines perhaps waned, and a new energy began to bubble up, not in the old heartland of Austria, but further west, along the fertile river valleys of the Rhine and the Marne in what is now eastern France, Switzerland, and southwest Germany. Around 450 BCE, the old order gave way to a new and astonishingly vibrant culture, one that would spread its distinctive art and warrior ethos across an entire continent. This was the Age of La Tène, named for a site on the shores of Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where centuries later, thousands of their finest creations were found, sacrificed to the dark waters as offerings to their gods. The people of the La Tène culture are the first people we can, with some confidence, call Celts. And the most electrifying thing they brought into the world was their art. It was a complete revolution of the senses. Where Hallstatt art had been formal, static, and obsessed with lines and angles, La Tène art was fluid, organic, and alive with motion. It was an art of masterful abstraction, a dizzying dance of spirals, S-curves, and swirling trumpet-like tendrils that flowed across the surfaces of their metalwork. It was a magical style, filled with hidden faces and beasts that would suddenly emerge from the complex patterns only to dissolve back into the flow. It was an art designed to trick the eye and mesmerize the soul, an art of now you see it, now you don't. This new aesthetic was the product of a confident and worldly people. Their artisans borrowed motifs from the cultures they now bordered and traded with, the vine scrolls and palmettes of the Greeks and Etruscans to the south, the stylized animals of the Scythian horse nomads to the east. But they never simply copied them. They absorbed these foreign ideas and transformed them into something entirely new, something unmistakably their own. This swirling, energetic art was not meant to be shut away in a tomb. It was meant to be seen, to be worn, to flash in the sun on the battlefield. It adorned the magnificent golden torques, or neck rings, that were the ultimate symbol of the warrior aristocrat. It flowed across the surfaces of their bronze helmets, their elaborate shield bosses, and the scabbards of their long iron swords. And it was with these swords that the La Tène Celts carved their name across Europe. They were true masters of iron. While their most prestigious decorative items were often crafted from bronze or gold, their weapons and tools were forged from high-quality iron, and in some cases, early forms of steel. The La Tène longsword was a fearsome weapon, expertly crafted for both cutting and thrusting, a testament to their advanced blacksmithing skills. Armed with these superior weapons, and driven by a fierce warrior culture that prized honor and heroic deeds above all else, they exploded out of their Western European heartland in a dramatic and far-reaching expansion. To the south, bands of Celtic warriors swept into Italy. In 390 BCE, they famously descended upon the young city of Rome, sacking it and putting it to the torch, a humiliation the Romans would never forget. They then settled in the fertile Po Valley, which for centuries would be known as Cisalpine Gaul, or Gaul on this side of the Alps. To the east, other groups migrated down the Danube River Valley, clashing with the tribes of the Balkans and the Greek kingdoms of Macedon and Thrace. In 279 BCE, a Celtic army even sacked the sacred Greek sanctuary of Delphi. Some of these eastern wanderers crossed the Hellespont into Anatolia and carved out a kingdom for themselves in the central highlands, a land that would become known as Galatia, the land of the Gauls. And to the west, the culture spread from its heartland across all of modern-day France, and eventually across the sea to Britain and Ireland, which would become the last great refuge of Celtic culture. This dramatic spread has created one of the great debates of European history. Does the appearance of Latin-style pottery and metalwork in a place like Ireland mean that a great migration of Celtic people arrived from the continent, conquering the locals and replacing them? This was the old view. The more modern understanding is far more complex. There were certainly migrations, bands of warriors, and their families seeking new lands. But the spread of Latin culture may also have been a spread of ideas, a kind of prestigious cultural package. Local chieftains in Britain or Spain may have seen the power and success of the Latin warrior ethos and adopted its trappings, the art, the weapons, the Celtic language, to enhance their own status. To be Celtic, then, was not necessarily a matter of bloodline, but of belonging to a shared, continent-wide warrior culture. The world of Latin was never a unified empire. It was a shifting mosaic of hundreds of independent and often warring tribes. By the end of the period, they were living in large fortified settlements the Romans called oppida, the first true towns to appear north of the Alps. These were bustling centers of trade, industry, and religion. For nearly 500 years, this dynamic, artistic, and warlike culture dominated Europe north of the Mediterranean. They were a people of profound contradictions, fiercely individualistic, yet bound by a shared artistic vision, prone to fragmentation and internal conflict, yet capable of uniting into terrifying armies. Let the final image be of a single, beautifully crafted object, a bronze mirror, perhaps, its back covered in a dizzying maze of spirals and curves. As you turn it in the firelight, the patterns seem to shift and move, creating an illusion of unending depth. It is the perfect symbol for the Celtic soul, restless, intricate, beautiful, and forever in motion. The image of Celtic warriors storming through the unpaved streets of a small, terrified city on the Tiber River in 390 BCE is a dramatic one. It was a brutal encounter, a clash between the swirling artistic energy of the Latin Celts and the nascent, disciplined power of the Roman Republic. But for the Celts, it was a raid, a violent interruption. For the peoples of the Italian peninsula, it was a traumatic event in a story that was already centuries old. To understand that story, we must gently rewind the clock, leaving the Celtic warriors at the gates, and travel back to the dawn of the Iron Age in Italy, a time when Rome was little more than a collection of muddy huts, and the true masters of the land were a mysterious and sophisticated people who loved life and grew rich from the metals of the earth. Let your mind settle on the Italian peninsula around the 8th century BCE. It is not a single, unified country, but a vibrant, competitive mosaic of peoples. In the south, Greek colonists are building new cities, bringing their alphabet, their gods, and their culture to what they call Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. In the central plains, along the river Tiber, live a hardy, pastoral people known as the Latins. And to their north, in the beautiful rolling hills of modern-day Tuscany, lives the region's dominant superpower, the Etruscans. For centuries, they were the most advanced, most powerful, and wealthiest civilization in the Western Mediterranean, and they are also one of its most enduring enigmas. The mystery of the Etruscans begins with their origin. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote that they were migrants, a people who had sailed from Lydia in Anatolia, modern Turkey, to escape a terrible famine. The Roman historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, however, insisted they were native Italians who had always been there. Adding to the puzzle is their language. Preserved in thousands of short inscriptions, it is unlike any other in Europe, a non-Indo-European tongue whose secrets we have only partially unlocked. The modern consensus is that their culture was a unique and brilliant fusion, growing from the local Iron Age roots of the Villanovan culture, but deeply enriched by intense contact with Greek and Phoenician traders from the East. Whatever their origins, by 700 BCE, they were a formidable presence. Their power was built on a foundation of incredible mineral wealth. The lands of Etruria were rich in copper and, most importantly, iron. The nearby island of Elba, its coastline famously stained red from its vast iron ore deposits, was essentially a massive open-air factory for the Etruscan metal industry. From their coastal cities, Etruscan smiths smelted and worked immense quantities of iron, far more than they needed for themselves. They became the great arms dealers and metal exporters of their age, trading iron bars and finished goods across the Mediterranean, from Gaul to Greece to Carthage. This iron-fueled trade made the Etruscan princes fabulously wealthy. We know this because of their extraordinary tombs. The Etruscans built vast and elaborate necropolises, or cities of the dead, that were often more durable than the cities of the living. Instead of mournful, somber places, these tombs are a vibrant celebration of life. They were carved from the soft volcanic rock to look like the interiors of Etruscan homes, with sloped roofs, stone furniture, and walls covered in brightly colored frescoes. These paintings show us a confident, joyful, and surprisingly egalitarian people. We see men and women banqueting together on shared couches, listening to musicians, playing games, dancing, fishing, and hunting. It is a world of pleasure and feasting, a vibrant snapshot of a culture that, while powerful, seemed to embrace the good things in life. And while this magnificent Etruscan civilization was flourishing, what of Rome? In this early period, Rome was an insignificant backwater. It was a collection of small villages scattered across 7 low hills near a convenient crossing point on the Tiber River. It was a settlement of Latin-speaking shepherds and farmers, strategically located but culturally and politically second rate compared to the great Etruscan city-states to the north. For over a century, this humble settlement fell under heavy Etruscan influence. A dynasty of Etruscan kings, the Tarquins, ruled the city. It was under their influence that Rome first began to look like a real city. They drained the marshy lowlands that would become the Roman Forum, built the first great temples, and introduced technologies like the stone arch. The Romans even adopted their alphabet from the Etruscans, who had themselves adapted it from the Greeks. But the Romans were a proud and resentful people, and in the traditional year of 509 BCE, they rose up, expelled the last Etruscan king, Tarquinius the Proud, and established their own form of government, the Republic. This was the beginning of a long struggle. The young, scrappy Roman Republic was now in direct competition with the older, wealthier Etruscan civilization, and iron was the great equalizer. The Etruscans' power came from their near monopoly on the best metal ores, but the Romans, through grit, discipline, and a remarkable talent for social and military organization, could field their own army. Their strength was the legion, a force of citizen farmers, each equipped with an iron-tipped spear and an iron sword. Iron was now common enough that a state's power no longer depended on controlling the mines, but on its ability to mobilize and discipline its manpower. The sack of their city by the Celts was a horrifying setback, but it did not break them. It was from these humble beginnings, fueled by the democratic strength of iron and forged in the crucible of constant warfare, that this small city-state would eventually recover and begin its relentless march to conquer not just the Etruscans, but all of Italy, and finally, the entire Mediterranean world. Let us now take a great leap, leaving behind the sun-drenched landscapes and nascent empires of the Mediterranean and traveling far to the north. We fly over the snow-capped Alps, over the deep forests of Central Europe, to a world of misty coastlines, windswept plains, and dark, brooding wetlands. This is the Iron Age of Scandinavia and northern Germany, a land without great cities, without writing, without the monumental stone architecture of the South. It was a world of scattered farmsteads and wooden longhouses, a society of fierce loyalties and tribal chieftains. And at the very heart of this world, both physically and spiritually, lay the bog. The peat bog was the defining feature of the northern landscape. These vast, damp, acidic wetlands were seen as liminal spaces, places that were neither fully land nor fully water, gateways to the supernatural. They were mysterious, dangerous, and sacred, but they also held a unique and magical gift. Unlike the Etruscans, who had to tunnel into mountainsides on the island of Elba for their ore, the peoples of the north simply harvested their iron from the bog itself. This was bog iron, and it was, in a sense, a renewable resource. The process was a quiet, natural alchemy. Iron-rich groundwater would seep into the acidic bog, where certain kinds of oxygen-starved bacteria would go to work, causing the dissolved iron to precipitate out of the water. Over time, this iron would collect in the peat as small, lumpy, rust-colored nodules, like strange metallic potatoes. Once a year, perhaps in the spring after the frosts had thawed, the people of a farmstead or village would go out to the bogs to harvest this gift. They would wade into the murky, tea-colored water, feeling for the hard nodules in the soft peat with their feet or with long wooden rakes. It was a local, small scale, and almost intimate process of gathering, not the brutal industrial mining of the South. The collected ore would be washed and then roasted in a fire to dry it out and remove impurities before being smelted in a small, well-tended clay bloomery furnace. For over 1,000 years, this strange, self-replenishing resource from the wetlands was the sole source of iron for the tools and weapons of the Nordic peoples. But the bogs did not only give, they also took, and they preserved what they took with an uncanny perfection. The unique chemistry of the peat bog, highly acidic, with low oxygen levels and cold temperatures, creates one of the most remarkable preservative environments on Earth. Instead of causing decay, the bog water tans organic materials. Wood, leather, and wool textiles can survive for millennia, but most hauntingly of all, so can human flesh. And scattered across the bogs of northern Europe, for centuries, peat cutters have been making the most astonishing and unsettling discoveries, the bog bodies. The most famous of these silent ambassadors from the past is Toland Man, discovered in a Danish bog in 1950. The men who found him were so convinced they had stumbled upon a recent murder victim that they immediately called the police. The body was that of a man, curled on his side as if sleeping. His face was so perfectly preserved that the fine wrinkles around his eyes and the day's growth of stubble on his chin were clearly visible. He wore a pointed leather cap on his head and a simple belt around his waist, and drawn tight around his neck, its long tail trailing down his back, was a finely braided leather noose. He had been hanged or garroted and then placed with what appears to be great care into the bog. He is not alone. Hundreds of such bodies have been found, from the Graubal man with his deeply slit throat to the young girl from Windeby in Germany. They almost all met violent ends, yet they seem to have been laid to rest with a kind of gentle reverence. This is the profound mystery of the bog people. Who were they? For a long time, it was assumed they were criminals, executed for their crimes, and cast into the bog to deny them a proper burial. But another, more compelling theory suggests they were victims of ritual sacrifice. Perhaps they were kings, nobles, or chosen individuals who were offered as gifts to the gods of the bog, perhaps during a time of famine or war, to ensure the continued fertility of the land. The analysis of Toland Man's last meal, a simple porridge of barley and flax seeds, suggests a humble, perhaps ritualistic final supper before he was sent to the gods. It was not only people that were given to the bogs. These wetlands were also a vast repository for votive offerings. Magnificent treasures have been pulled from the peat, objects too valuable to have been lost by accident. Great, ornate silver cauldrons, like the one from Gundestrup in Denmark, were disassembled and carefully deposited. In other bogs, archaeologists have found enormous caches of weapons from the Roman Iron Age, hundreds of swords, spears, and shields, the equipment of an entire defeated army. The swords were often bent or broken, the shields so hacked apart, ritually killed before being consigned to the water, a spectacular offering to thank the gods for victory. Let your final thought tonight settle on the serene, sleeping face of Toland Man. He is a man of about 40, from 2,300 years ago, yet he feels as if he could wake at any moment. His calm expression, paired with the brutal violence of the noose around his neck, perfectly captures the spirit of the Northern Iron Age. It was a world where the sacred and the mundane were deeply intertwined. The bog was both a practical resource, the source of the iron that armed and fed them, and a powerful, living entity, a gateway to the gods that demanded the most profound sacrifices in return. The bog gave them their strength, and it has kept their secrets perfectly. We must travel now, far from the cool, misty wetlands of the north, and back to the cradle of civilization, the hot, arid plains of Mesopotamia. Here, between the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the relationship with iron was not one of quiet reverence or magical discovery. Here, in the heartland of what is now northern Iraq, iron was being reforged in the fires of ambition, transformed from a simple material into the very spine of the most terrifying and efficient war machine the world had ever known. This was the age of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and they were the first to truly understand the dark power that could be unleashed when iron was married to the organized will of the state. Around 900 BCE, a new power began to stir in the ancient city-states of Ashur and Nineveh. The great Bronze Age empires, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Babylonians, were either gone or in a period of weakness. The power vacuum they left in the Near East was being filled by the Assyrians, a hardy, disciplined, and relentlessly ambitious people. For centuries, they had been a regional power, but now they began a 300-year campaign of conquest that would create the largest and most centralized empire the world had yet seen. And the engine of this expansion was their revolutionary approach to iron. While other cultures were still treating iron as a semi-precious metal or producing it in small local forges, the Assyrians were the first to think like a modern, industrial military power. They recognized that the key to dominance was not just having iron, but having it in overwhelming quantities. Their kings launched organized campaigns, not just for plunder or territory, but for the strategic purpose of securing the sources of iron ore in the Zagros Mountains of Iran and the Taurus Mountains of Anatolia, the old Hittite homeland. They established state-run armories and organized their blacksmiths into a vast hierarchical production system. Blacksmithing ceased to be a village craft and became a state industry dedicated to a single purpose, equipping the Assyrian army. The result was a military force unlike any that had come before. For the first time in history, an entire army, from the lowest foot soldier to the highest commander, could be fully and uniformly equipped with iron. The scale of this production is staggering to consider. Out of the Assyrian forges poured tens of thousands of identical, mass-produced iron spearheads, arrowheads, short swords, and conical helmets. Iron was used to create coats of lamellar armor, small, overlapping iron plates sewn onto a leather backing that gave their soldiers unprecedented protection. This industrialization of warfare gave the Assyrians a massive advantage over their enemies, who might still be fielding armies with a mix of bronze and the occasional iron weapon. But the Assyrian genius was not just in production, it was in organization. Their army was a professional, standing force, organized into specialized corps. Their infantry, protected by their iron helmets and armor, could advance in disciplined formations, a wall of spear points. They were pioneers in the use of cavalry, fielding mounted archers and lancers who could outmaneuver and harass their enemies. and their two-man chariots were made into heavier, more stable fighting platforms, essentially mobile missile launchers that could wreak havoc on an enemy line. Perhaps their most fearsome innovation was in the art of siege warfare. Before the Assyrians, a well-fortified city could hope to hold out against an army for years. The Assyrians turned siegecraft into a terrifying science. Their engineers, using iron tools for strength and durability, constructed monstrous engines of war. They built massive, multi-storied siege towers that could be rolled up to a city's walls, allowing archers to clear the ramparts. They developed huge, timber-framed battering rams, often with multiple iron-tipped heads, housed in armored sheds to protect the crews as they relentlessly pounded at a city's gates. Most insidiously, they had corps of sappers who would dig tunnels to undermine the foundations of the enemy's walls until they collapsed. For the inhabitants of a city watching the Assyrian army arrive and methodically set up its siege lines, the feeling must have been one of utter, hopeless dread. This dread was a weapon in itself. The Assyrians were masters of psychological warfare. They didn't just want to defeat their enemies, they wanted to terrorize them into submission so that others would not dare to resist. The walls of their great palaces at Nineveh and Nimrud were covered in acres of magnificently carved stone reliefs. These were not just art, they were state propaganda of the most brutal kind. They show, in unflinching detail, the Assyrian army on the march, the siege of cities, and the inevitable terrible aftermath. We see long lines of captured people being led away, their possessions piled on carts. We see scribes counting severed heads. The royal inscriptions that accompany these images are even more chilling, with kings boasting of the cities they turned into ruined hills, and the gruesome punishments they inflicted upon rebellious leaders. Their most effective policy of terror was mass deportation. After conquering a rebellious kingdom, the Assyrians would systematically round up tens of thousands of its people, the skilled craftsmen, the scribes, the ruling class, and forcibly march them to distant, undeveloped parts of their own empire. This cruel but effective policy achieved multiple goals at once. It broke the spirit and identity of the conquered people. It supplied the Assyrian heartland with a vast pool of skilled labor to build their palaces and temples, and it served as a terrifying example to any other vassal state that might be contemplating rebellion. So let the image settle of a single carved stone panel from the ruins of Nineveh. It depicts a row of Assyrian spearmen marching in perfect formation. Their faces are identical, their bodies clad in the same iron armor, their hands gripping the same iron-tipped spears. They are no longer just men. They are standardized, interchangeable components of a vast and impersonal machine. This was the ultimate achievement of the Assyrians, the creation of an imperial machine built from the iron of the mountains, maintained by a sophisticated bureaucracy, and fueled by a cold, calculated ideology of terror. They were the first true empire of the Iron Age. For all the noise made by the great war machines of the Assyrian kings, for all the terror inspired by their iron-clad armies, this was not the true revolution of the age. The story of iron that would most profoundly change the human journey was not taking place on the battlefield or in the courts of kings. It was happening far more quietly in countless anonymous fields and forgotten forests under the patient hand of the common farmer. The clash of an iron sword against a shield is a dramatic, momentary sound, but the soft, scraping whisper of an iron plowshare cutting through the earth is the sound of the future being born. This was the slow, silent, and most transformative revolution of all. For thousands of years, humanity's ability to grow food had been limited by the tools available. The earliest plow, the simple wooden ard, was little more than a sharpened stick used to scratch a shallow furrow in the ground. It worked well enough in the light, silty alluvial soils of the great river valleys, like the Nile in Egypt or the Euphrates in Mesopotamia, where civilization first took root. But much of the world's land was not so accommodating. The heavier, wetter, clay-rich soils of temperate Europe, or the rocky, root-tangled ground of the hills, were largely beyond the reach of a simple wooden plow. Bronze was rarely a solution. It was far too valuable to be wasted on a tool destined for such rough, abrasive work, and in many cases, it was too soft to stand up to the punishment. This created an invisible barrier, a limit on how much land could be farmed, and therefore how many people the world could support. The iron plowshare was the key that unlocked this vast, untapped potential. Iron was not only stronger and harder than bronze, but as we have seen, it was also far cheaper and more widely available. For the first time, it was economically feasible to attach a durable, sharp metal tip to the end of a wooden plow. This simple innovation was a monumental leap forward. An iron-tipped ard could now break open ground that had previously been untamable. It could slice through the dense mat of roots in a forest clearing, shrug off the impact of unseen rocks, and carve a deeper, more effective furrow in heavy clay soil. This one tool fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with the land. In Europe, especially north of the Alps, it was the engine of a massive expansion, paired with the iron axe, which could clear forests with unprecedented efficiency. The iron plow allowed the Hallstatt and Latin peoples to move into and cultivate the vast, fertile plains of the continent. Entire landscapes were reshaped. What had once been impenetrable forest, the domain of the hunter, was slowly transformed field by field into a landscape of agriculture. In the Near East and the Mediterranean, it allowed for more intensive farming. Hillsides that were once only good for grazing goats could now be terraced and plowed. Marginal lands could be brought into production, increasing the overall yield and resilience of a community. The consequences of this agricultural revolution rippled outwards, slowly but unstoppably. The most immediate effect was a dramatic increase in the food supply. More land under cultivation meant more grain, more olives, more of everything. A more stable and abundant food source is the single most important ingredient for population growth. And so, across the Iron Age world, from India to Ireland, the human population began a slow, steady, and irreversible climb. The world began to fill up. There were more farmers, more villages, and eventually more cities. Cities, after all, can only exist on the back of an agricultural surplus. A city is a place where people, priests, soldiers, kings, merchants, artisans, do not produce their own food. They must be fed by the farmers in the surrounding countryside. As the efficiency of farming increased, a single farming family could produce enough surplus grain to support not just themselves, but 1, 2, or even more non-farmers in a nearby town. This is what fueled the rise of the Greek polis, where citizen farmers could leave their fields to debate in the agora. It's what allowed for the growth of the Celtic oppida into bustling centers of craft and trade, and it provided the immense human and agricultural resources that the great empires, like the Assyrian and later the Persian, could tax and mobilize. Of course, this was not a sudden, overnight transformation. It was a revolution in slow motion, a process that took many centuries to fully unfold. An iron plowshare, even a small one, was still a valuable object to an early Iron Age farmer. It would have been carefully maintained, lovingly passed down from father to son. The adoption of these new tools was patchy and gradual, spreading slowly from village to village. The demographic boom they unleashed was likewise a creeping generational change, almost imperceptible to the people living through it. But its cumulative effect was absolute, and the plow was not alone. The humble iron sickle, with its curved, serrated blade, allowed for a faster, more efficient harvest, gathering more grain before it could be lost to weather or pests. The iron-tipped hoe made weeding and tilling gardens easier. The iron axe not only cleared the land, but provided the timber for better, more durable houses, barns, fences, and carts. Each new application of this cheap, strong metal into the daily life of the common person was another small thread in a vast tapestry of change that was being woven across the landscape, quietly raising the entire ceiling of human potential. Let the image that stays with you be of a farmer, silhouetted against a setting sun, leaning on his plow. In his hand, he feels the cool, solid weight of the iron share. It is not a thing of beauty or glory, but in that small piece of metal lies the power to break the earth, to feed a family, and to build a world. The quiet, world-shaping power of the iron axe and plow was a universal force, but it expressed itself differently in every landscape it touched. In Europe, it cleared the temperate forests. In the Levant, it broke the soil of the stony hills. But to witness its most epic and transformative impact, we must travel east, beyond the mountains of Persia, to the vast subcontinent of India. Here, iron did not just enable a new society to grow, it empowered an entire civilization to conquer a continent within a continent, a great green jungle that had stood as an impassable barrier for 1,000 years. To understand this transformation, we must first picture the world of the early Vedic period, around 1500 BCE. This is the world described in the hymns of the Rig Veda, the oldest sacred text of Hinduism. It was a society of semi-nomadic, cattle-herding tribes, the Indo-Aryans, who dominated the plains of the Punjab and the upper reaches of the Indus River Valley in the northwest. They were a pastoral people, their wealth measured in cows, their days governed by the rituals of the sacrificial fire, their culture spreading slowly eastward. But as they moved east, they came up against a formidable natural wall, the Gangetic Plain. Today, this is the densely populated heartland of India, but in the late Bronze Age, it was a vast, sweltering, and intimidating wilderness. It was a thick, monsoonal forest, a dense jungle teeming with tigers and elephants, its soil heavy, wet, and held fast by a thick mat of roots. For a people equipped with bronze tools, this world was largely impenetrable. Bronze was too valuable to be risked on axes that would quickly dull or break, and too soft for plowshares that could tame the heavy, waterlogged soil. Then, sometime around 1000 BCE, Knowledge of the dark metal, Shyama Ayas as it was called in Sanskrit, began to filter into India. As in the West, its adoption was slow, but its impact was inevitable. This new, hard, and affordable metal provided the toolkit for a new era of pioneers. It was the iron axe, the parashu, and the iron plowshare, the surra, that would finally unlock the Gangetic Plain, and in doing so, completely reshape Indian civilization. What followed was one of the great epics of human settlement, a centuries-long struggle between humanity and the forest. Imagine generations of pioneers, families, and small clans pushing eastward from the established settlements into the great unknown. Their primary weapon in this slow-motion conquest was the iron axe. With it, they could fell the massive trees of the jungle with an efficiency that had been unimaginable just a few generations prior. The work was arduous, relentless, a lifetime spent carving out a small clearing from the immense, suffocating forest. Later Vedic texts, like the epic Mahabharata, preserve a distant memory of this time, speaking of great sages and heroes burning down entire sections of the forest to create land for settlement, a mythic echo of the very real process of slash and burn agriculture practiced by these early pioneers. The fire god, Agni, one of the central deities of the Vedic pantheon, took on a new role as the great clearer of the land. Once a clearing was made, the second revolutionary tool came into play. The heavy alluvial soil, enriched by millennia of leaf fall and river silt, was incredibly fertile, but it was also incredibly difficult to work. The iron plowshare was the only tool strong enough to break this virgin earth, allowing for the systematic cultivation of new crops. And the crop that would come to define this new world was rice. The wet, monsoonal climate of the Gangetic Plain was perfect for rice paddies, and this astonishingly productive grain would become the staple food that would fuel a massive population boom. This great clearing of the forest and the shift to a settled, rice-based agriculture completely transformed Vedic society. The old, semi-nomadic, pastoral way of life faded into memory. People began to live in permanent villages, or grama, their lives governed by the predictable rhythm of the agricultural seasons. This more stable and productive way of life created a food surplus, which, as we have seen elsewhere, is the essential ingredient for social complexity. The old, fluid tribal structures of the Rigvedic period gave way to a new political landscape. The surplus could support a class of people who did not farm: priests, warriors, and kings. Hereditary monarchies began to emerge, ruling over defined territories. These were the Janapadas, or footholds of the people, the first true kingdoms of ancient India. By the 6th century BCE, 16 of these Mahajanapadas, or great kingdoms, dominated the political landscape of northern India, with names like Kuru, Panchala, Kosala, and Magadha. They built the first cities India had seen in over 1,000 years, centers of trade, craft, and political power. Religion and society changed too. The focus of religious life shifted from the simple fire sacrifices of the pastoralists to the vast, complex, and expensive royal rituals described in the later Vedic texts, the Brahmanas. The caste system, or Varna, became more rigid and elaborate, a way to organize a more complex and settled society. And from this new world of cities and kingdoms, a ferment of new philosophical and religious ideas would arise, which we will explore later. Let the scene settle in your mind, a quiet diptych of two worlds. First, the old world, a priest in the open plains of the Punjab, chanting hymns to the rising sun as the smoke from a small fire drifts into the sky. Then, the new world, a farmer, centuries later, standing at the edge of a small clearing deep in the misty Gangetic forest. He leans on his simple wooden plow, its tip armed with a piece of dark, hard iron. The clearing he has carved is small, the forest around him immense, but he is the pioneer of a new civilization. The simple tool in his hand is not just for tilling the soil, it is laying the very foundation for the great empires, the epic poems, and the profound spiritual quests of classical India. As the great forests of the Ganges plain were being cleared and a new civilization was taking root in India, a parallel yet strikingly different drama was unfolding even further to the east, in the fertile river valleys of ancient China. Here, too, a long period of political decay and violent conflict was giving birth to an explosion of profound philosophical thought. And here, the journey into the Iron Age took a radically different and technologically revolutionary path. While the blacksmiths of the West were still laboriously hammering solid lumps of metal, the master metallurgists of Zhou Dynasty China were achieving a kind of industrial magic. They were turning iron into a liquid like water, and in doing so, they unleashed its power on a scale the rest of the world could not yet imagine. The story begins with the long, slow decline of the Zhou dynasty. Having overthrown the previous Shang dynasty around 1046 BCE, the early Zhou kings ruled a powerful centralized state. But their system was a feudal one. They granted authority over vast territories to relatives and loyal nobles, who in turn swore allegiance to the king. For a time, the system held, but as the centuries passed, the power of the central king in his capital grew weaker and weaker, while the feudal lords who ruled the outlying states became in all but name independent kings. Their loyalty to the Zhou throne became a mere fiction, a polite nod to a forgotten past. It was during this period of slow political decay that Chinese artisans, building on a long and sophisticated tradition of bronze casting, made a monumental technological leap. They developed the blast furnace by constructing taller furnaces with better heat-resistant clay linings, and by using powerful bellows, perhaps a double-acting piston system that could pump a continuous stream of air, they achieved something no one else had. They could generate the ferocious temperatures in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit required to fully melt iron. The result was liquid, molten iron, which could be poured into molds just like bronze. This was cast iron, and it was a complete game changer. The rest of the world was still in a wrought iron age, a craft-based system where a single smith would hammer a single object into shape. China had vaulted directly into a cast iron age, a system of mass production. A single foundry with a series of sand or clay molds could now produce dozens, even hundreds, of identical iron objects in a day. This new industrial power first began to transform the economy. Cast iron plowshares, far more durable than the bronze or wooden ones they replaced, became widely available, increasing agricultural output. Strong iron pots and pans became common household items. But the full, terrifying potential of this new technology was realized as the Zhou kingdom continued to fracture. The period from roughly 771 to 476 BCE is known as the Spring and Autumn period, a time of escalating warfare between the dozens of competing feudal states. Then, from about 475 BCE, the last pretenses of order collapsed entirely, and China plunged into the infamous Warring States period. The seven most powerful states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Yan, Han, Zhao, and Wei, were now locked in a 2.5-century-long winner-take-all struggle for survival and ultimate domination. It was a time of almost unimaginable violence, and it was fueled by cast iron. Armies swelled to unprecedented sizes, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These vast new armies of peasant conscripts were equipped with mass-produced cast iron weapons, the heads for long dagger axes, sharp arrowheads, and short swords. Defensive technology kept pace, with soldiers wearing armor made of small cast iron plates laced together. Warfare became more systematic, more brutal, and more total. And yet, from this crucible of unending war and social chaos, there arose one of the most brilliant flowerings of human thought in history, a period known as the 100 Schools of Thought. The constant crisis, the collapse of old norms and traditions, and the desperate search for a path back to stability forced the era's greatest minds to ask the most fundamental questions. What is the basis of a just society? What is the ideal relationship between a ruler and his people? What is the nature of the universe itself? The rulers of the warring states, eager for any intellectual or strategic advantage, became patrons to these wandering scholars, inviting them to their courts to offer advice. From this ferment of ideas, the great philosophical traditions of China were born. There was Confucius and his followers, like Mencius, who argued that the only way out of the chaos was to look to the past. They advocated a return to ritual, tradition, social harmony, and filial piety. A ruler, they said, must govern not by force, but by moral example, and his people would follow. Offering a radically different vision were the Taoists, with their semi-legendary founder Laozi. They saw the endless striving and scheming of society as the source of all suffering. The solution was not in more rules and rituals, but in less. They taught that one should reject the artificial world of human ambition and seek to live in quiet harmony with the Tao, the great, ineffable, natural way of the cosmos. And then there were the legalists. Thinkers like Shang Yang and Han Fei were the ultimate political realists. They looked at the chaos and concluded that Confucian morality was naive and Taoist passivity was useless. Human beings, they argued, are inherently selfish and lazy. The only way to create an orderly and powerful state is through a system of strict, impersonal laws backed by harsh and certain punishments for any infraction and generous rewards for absolute disobedience. The state and the absolute power of the ruler was everything. These schools and dozens of others contended for influence in a vibrant, desperate marketplace of ideas. So let the final scene be one of profound contrast. Picture a vast foundry on a dark night, the sky lit by the hellish orange glow of a blast furnace. Men shout and sweat as they channel a river of fiery, liquid iron into molds, creating the weapons that will be used in the next bloody campaign. And not far away, in the quiet lamplight of a scholar's study, a man in simple robes unrolls a heavy scroll of bamboo strips, dips his brush in ink, and carefully paints the characters for a new idea about justice or nature or order. The intense fire of the furnace and the quiet light of the lamp were born of the same crisis. They were the twin children of the warring states, an age of unprecedented violence and unparalleled wisdom, both forged in the revolutionary heat of cast iron. From the fiery furnaces and philosophical debates of ancient China, let our journey now drift southwest across the vastness of Asia and the Indian Ocean to another of the world's great and ancient river valleys. For as long as there has been a civilization in Egypt, there has been another civilization just to its south, along the upper reaches of the Nile. This was the land of Nubia, a kingdom the Egyptians called Kush. For millennia, the relationship had been one of domination. The powerful pharaohs of the new kingdom had colonized Nubia, treating it as a vassal state, a source of gold, exotic animals, soldiers for their armies, and slaves. The Nubians, in turn, had become deeply Egyptianized, worshipping Egyptian gods, building small pyramids for their dead kings, and even using Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were the southern provincials, living in the shadow of the great imperial power to their north. But by the 8th century BCE, the world had turned upside down. The great Egyptian empire of the Bronze Age was a distant memory. The land of the pharaohs had fallen into a long period of decline and fragmentation known as the Third Intermediate Period. It was weak, disunited, and ruled by competing local warlords and Libyan dynasties. The center had collapsed, and as Egypt weakened, the old southern province of Kush grew strong. In their capital city of Napata, a line of powerful Nubian kings had consolidated their rule, and they looked upon the chaos in Egypt not with greed, but with a kind of pious disappointment. They saw themselves not as foreigners, but as the true, faithful keepers of the pharaonic flame, the true worshippers of the god Amun, whose great temple they shared. They believed the spiritual decay in Egypt was an offense to the gods, and that it was their sacred duty to put things right. What followed was one of the most remarkable role reversals in ancient history. Around 744 BCE, the Kushite king Piye launched a full-scale invasion of Egypt. It was framed not as a foreign conquest, but as a holy crusade to restore order and traditional Egyptian values. His armies swept northwards, and after a series of campaigns, Piye and his successors conquered the entirety of Egypt, from the Nubian desert to the Mediterranean Sea. For the first time, a black pharaoh sat on the throne of the two lands. This was the 25th dynasty of Egypt, the dynasty of the Kushite kings, often called the Black Pharaohs. They did not rule as foreign oppressors. They embraced their role with passion, building and restoring temples, reviving ancient religious texts, and presenting themselves in art as traditional pharaohs, albeit with distinctively Kushite features. For nearly a century, the great civilization of the Nile was ruled from its southern periphery. But as the Kushite pharaohs were consolidating their new empire, another great imperial power was expanding from the east. Remember the Assyrians, with their brutally efficient ironclad war machine. Inevitably, the two expanding empires would collide in the Levant, fighting for control of the crucial cities of the eastern Mediterranean. The Kushite pharaohs fought to protect their sphere of influence, but they were ultimately outmatched. The Assyrian army, with its vast numbers and its mastery of industrial scale iron weaponry, was simply too formidable. In a series of devastating campaigns, the Assyrians pushed the Kushites out of Asia, invaded Egypt itself, and in 664 BCE, they sacked the ancient and holy capital of Thebes. The Kushite dream of ruling Egypt was over. They were forced to retreat south, back to their Nubian homeland. This encounter with the Assyrian war machine was a brutal but essential lesson. The Kushite rulers had seen firsthand the power of an empire that had fully mastered the production of iron, and they learned from it. Forced out of Egypt, the Kushite kingdom recentered itself. They moved their capital further south along the Nile, from Napata to the city of Meroe. This was a strategic masterstroke. The region around Meroe was not only safer from northern invasions, but it was also blessed with enormous, easily accessible deposits of iron ore, and crucially, vast forests of acacia trees that could be burned to make the charcoal needed for smelting. Here, in the heart of Africa, the Kushites would build their own iron industrial complex. For the next several centuries, the city of Meroe became one of the greatest iron-producing centers of the ancient world. The scale of their industry was immense, far surpassing anything that had been seen on the Nile before. Archaeologists excavating the ruins of the city have found not just the remains of furnaces, but also colossal mounds of dark, glassy slag, the waste product of the smelting process. These slag heaps, some of them covering acres of land, are silent monuments to centuries of industrial production, earning Meroe the nickname the Birmingham of ancient Africa. From these forges, Meroitic iron was fashioned into weapons for their armies, which held off Roman advances for centuries, and tools for their farmers. But it was also a major export. Meroitic iron was traded east, through ports on the Red Sea and into the vast network of the Indian Ocean, and it was traded south, deep into the African continent. For a long time, it was believed that it was from Meroe that the knowledge of iron smelting spread to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. But recent archaeological finds have begun to tell a different, even more fascinating story. In places like Nigeria and Cameroon in Central Africa, evidence has been found of iron smelting that may be even older than the great industrial boom at Meroe. This raises the incredible possibility that iron technology was not just a gift passed down from the north, but may have been independently invented in Africa, a testament to the continent's own unique path of innovation. So let the final image be of the strange and beautiful ruins of Meroe. You see the sharp, steep-sided pyramids where the kings and queens of Kush were buried, a clear echo of their time in Egypt. But just beyond them, you see the other monuments of this civilization, the great, dark, silent hills of industrial slag. These are not as glamorous as the tombs of kings, but they tell a powerful story of resilience and adaptation. They are the legacy of a proud African kingdom that, after a brief and brilliant moment ruling one of the world's oldest empires, returned home, mastered the technology of a new age, and built a unique and enduring civilization of its own. From the grand imperial stage of warring states and rising dynasties, let our focus now draw inward, away from the sweeping movements of armies and peoples, and into the small, hot, fire-lit heart of the entire Iron Age. Let us enter the world of the blacksmith. In every village, in every city, in every military camp, From the misty bogs of Denmark to the industrial furnaces of Meroe, it was this anonymous, soot-stained figure who was the true agent of change. And for these craftsmen, the quest was not for quantity, but for quality. They were the inheritors of a fundamental problem. The simple wrought iron that emerged from the bloomery furnace was soft, unreliable, and often inferior to a good bronze. But they were also the keepers of a tantalizing secret, the memory of those rare, accidental, miraculous blades that emerge from the fire harder and sharper than anything seen before. The great, quiet project of the Iron Age smith was to turn that accident into an art. It was a slow, patient quest to unlock the hidden spirit of the metal, to learn its secret language, and to consciously create a substance that would eventually become known as steel. This journey of discovery was not one of scientific theory. No ancient smith knew what a carbon atom was. Their laboratory was the forge. Their knowledge was tactile, passed down through generations of masters and apprentices. It was a knowledge held in the hands, in the feel of the hammer's rebound, in the ear that could distinguish the sounds of good and bad metal, and in the eye that could read the subtle colors of the glowing iron. Through endless trial and error, they began to unravel the first great secret, that the fire itself could change the nature of the iron. They noticed that a piece of iron left to cook for a long time in the deepest, hottest part of the charcoal fire would often come out harder. What they were unknowingly doing was carburizing the metal. At high temperatures, the iron, hungry for other elements, would literally absorb carbon from the surrounding charcoal fire, infusing it into its surface. This thin, carbon-rich outer layer was in effect a layer of steel. To make this process more reliable, they developed ingenious techniques. A smith might seal a newly forged iron blade inside a clay box, packing it tightly with charcoal dust, bone fragments, and scraps of leather, all rich sources of carbon, and then leave that box buried in the hot embers of the forge for hours or even days. This technique, called case hardening, was like marinating the iron in the very essence of hardness. Other smiths, particularly the Celtic and Germanic craftsmen of Europe, developed the beautiful and effective technique of pattern welding. They would forge together thin strips of high-carbon iron, hard but brittle, and low-carbon iron, soft but flexible, twisting them into intricate patterns before hammering them into a single, laminated blade. The result was a weapon that combined the best of both worlds, the tough, flexible core preventing it from shattering, and the hard steel edges capable of holding a razor-sharp edge. But adding carbon was only the first step. For this new carbon-infused iron held another secret, one that was violent and dramatic. This was the quench. Imagine a smith pulling a blade from the fire at the perfect, luminous, straw-yellow heat. He moves with a swift, practiced grace and plunges the glowing metal into a trough of water or oil. The result is a sudden, explosive hiss, a violent cloud of steam, and an almost instantaneous cooling of the metal. This thermal shock does something miraculous to the internal structure of the steel. It freezes the carbon and iron atoms into a new, incredibly rigid and tightly laced crystalline formation. The result is a blade of astonishing hardness, far harder than it was before the quench. But this new power comes at a terrible price. The blade is now as brittle as glass. It can hold an edge of surgical sharpness, but if you were to strike it against another sword, it would shatter into 1,000 pieces. It is a useless, beautiful, fragile thing. And so, the smith had to learn the third and most subtle secret of all, the temper. This was the art of giving the hardened blade back its soul, of trading a little of its extreme hardness for a great deal of toughness and flexibility. The smith would carefully polish a section of the brittle blade so he could see the bare metal. Then he would gently, carefully begin to reheat it, not to a glow, but just enough to warm it. As the temperature slowly rose, a magical thing would happen. A shimmering film of oxide would form on the polished surface, its color changing with the precise temperature of the steel. First, a faint pale yellow, then a deeper straw, then brown, then a vibrant purple, a peacock blue, and finally a dull gray. The ancient smiths learned to read these colors as a perfect thermometer. They knew that for a sword or a knife, which needed to be tough, they had to stop the heating process when the color reached a straw or a light brown and let the blade cool slowly in the air. For a tool like an axe, which could be harder, they might let it go to a purple. This gentle reheating or tempering relaxed the rigid internal structure of the steel, allowing it to absorb shock without breaking. This three-part ritual, carburize to add the spirit, quench to make it hard, and temper to make it strong, was the secret recipe for true steel. It was a form of alchemy, discovered not in a philosopher's lab, but in the smoke and noise of 1,000 anonymous forges, a testament to generations of patient observation and craft. From the quiet, patient world of the blacksmith's forge, where the very substance of the age was being perfected, we now return to the grand stage of history. The great empires, after all, were the ultimate customers for this new, stronger metal. We left the Near East in the hands of the terrifyingly efficient Assyrian war machine, an empire built on iron and fear. But such a brutal system could not last forever. In 612 BCE, after centuries of dominance, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was finally sacked and burned by a coalition of its most bitter enemies, led by the Babylonians and a new power that had arisen on the Iranian plateau, the Medes. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Neo-Babylonian Empire, in all its golden metropolitan glory, would be the new master of the world. But their reign was to be short-lived. For living under the rule of the Medes was another related Iranian people, the Persians. And they were about to be led by a man who would not only inherit the imperial tools of the Iron Age, but would use them to create a new and far more enduring model of what an empire could be. His name was Cyrus, a figure who became a legend even in his own time. Born the ruler of a small Persian vassal kingdom, he was a political and military genius of the highest order. Around 559 BCE, he rose in rebellion against his Median overlords, and in a few short years, he had defeated them and united the Iranian peoples of the Medes and the Persians under his single rule. This was only the beginning. With the combined might of the Iranian horsemen at his command, Cyrus embarked on one of the most astonishing campaigns of conquest in history. He swept west into Anatolia, conquering the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia and its king Croesus. He subdued the Greek cities along the Ionian coast. He pushed his borders east into Central Asia, and then in 539 BCE, he turned his sights on the greatest prize of all, the ancient, magnificent, and seemingly impregnable city of Babylon. The story of its fall has been told for millennia. The Greek historian Herodotus writes that the Persian army diverted the course of the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, allowing his soldiers to march into the capital along the dry riverbed, taking the Babylonians completely by surprise. However it was achieved, the fall of Babylon cemented Cyrus's status as the undisputed master of the Near East. In a little over 20 years, he had forged the largest empire the world had ever known, the Achaemenid Persian Empire. But it is what he did after the conquest that reveals his true genius. He was the heir to a long tradition of Iron Age imperial power, most notably that of the Assyrians. But where the Assyrians had ruled through a calculated policy of terror, mass deportation, and the brutal suppression of local cultures, Cyrus chose a radically different path. Our most stunning evidence for this comes from a small barrel-shaped clay object, no bigger than a loaf of bread, known as the Cyrus cylinder. Discovered in the ruins of Babylon, it is inscribed with a declaration from Cyrus to his new subjects. In the text, Cyrus does not present himself as a foreign conqueror. Instead, he declares that he was chosen by Babylon's own chief god, Marduk, to restore order. He condemns the previous Babylonian king for his impiety and then makes a series of revolutionary promises. He declares that he will allow all the peoples who had been forcibly deported to Babylon by previous kings to return to their native lands. He promises to help them rebuild their ruined temples and restore their religious practices. This was a complete reversal of Assyrian policy. For the Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon a generation earlier, this was a world-changing decree, allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their sacred temple. But was this an act of genuine, high-minded tolerance, or was it simply a more pragmatic and effective form of statecraft? The truth is likely a brilliant combination of both. Cyrus seems to have understood a profound political truth, that an empire built on the loyalty of its diverse subjects is far more stable and prosperous than one held together by fear. By respecting local religions and traditions, he was not weakening his own power. He was strengthening it, giving the many different peoples of his vast empire a reason to support Persian rule rather than constantly rebel against it. It was a discovery that respect could be a more powerful imperial tool than terror. Of course, this enlightened policy was backed by an army of overwhelming force. The Persians had learned the lessons of the Assyrians well. Their military was a vast professional force, equipped with the best iron weapons of the day. The core of the army was its infantry, armed with spears and short swords, but their greatest strength was the combination of cavalry and archers. The Persians and Medes were master horsemen, and their mounted archers could harass and demoralize an enemy long before the infantry ever clashed. At the heart of the army was the king's personal guard, a corps of 10,000 elite soldiers known as the Immortals, so named because their number was always kept at exactly 10,000. As soon as one man fell, he was immediately replaced. To hold this vast multicultural empire together, Cyrus and his successors, particularly Darius the Great, created a sophisticated administrative system. The empire was divided into provinces, or satrapies, each governed by a satrap who answered directly to the king. To ensure loyalty, a separate military commander and a royal inspector, known as the king's eyes and ears, were also stationed in each province. Tying it all together was the Royal Road, a great highway that stretched over 1,600 miles from the Aegean coast to the heart of Persia. A system of postal relays with fresh horses at regular intervals meant that royal messengers could cover the entire length of the road in as little as 7 days, a stunning feat of communication that allowed the king to govern his sprawling domain effectively. This was the true foundation of Persian power, an iron-equipped army, a tolerant multicultural policy, and a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage it all. Cyrus had created the world's first true superpower. The great Persian Empire, in all its vast, multicultural, and well-administered glory, seemed to be the very definition of a stable world order. Its power, built on a foundation of iron-equipped armies and a sophisticated policy of tolerance, stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean Sea. But on those shores, it lapped against a world that operated on a completely different set of principles. Here, in mainland Greece, were the small, quarrelsome, and fiercely independent city-states, the children of the Greek Dark Age. And in the early 5th century BCE, these two worlds, the universal empire and the particularist city-state, would collide in a conflict that would not only define the future of the West, but would be remembered as one of history's greatest David and Goliath stories. The conflict began, as many do, on the periphery. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast in Anatolia, which had been swallowed by Cyrus's conquests, had never happily accepted Persian rule. In 489 BCE, they rose in a desperate revolt. The city of Athens, their democratic cousin across the sea, sent a small number of ships to aid them. The revolt was eventually and brutally crushed by the Persian king, Darius the Great. But the intervention of Athens had not gone unnoticed. To the ruler of a vast, centralized empire, the idea of a small, independent city meddling in his affairs was an intolerable offense. Darius vowed to make an example of Athens, and in 490 BCE, a Persian fleet carrying a powerful expeditionary force landed on the shores of Greece at a small bay called Marathon. The army that disembarked on the beach was a microcosm of the Persian Empire itself, a large, diverse force of infantry from across the satrapies, supported by cavalry and, most importantly, clouds of archers. Their strategy was a tried and tested one: to rain arrows upon the enemy from a distance, disrupt their formation, and then send in the infantry to clean up. Waiting for them on the hills above the plain was a much smaller army, composed almost entirely of the citizen soldiers of Athens. These were the hoplites. A hoplite was not a professional soldier. He was a farmer, a craftsman, a citizen who was expected to provide his own equipment and fight for the defense of his city. His key piece of equipment was the hoplon, or aspis, a large, round shield of wood and bronze. He wore a bronze helmet, greaves, and chest plate, and his primary weapon was a long 8-foot spear, the dory, tipped with a deadly leaf-shaped iron point. Fighting together, they formed the phalanx, a dense wall of overlapping shields and projecting spears. It was a heavy, powerful, and disciplined formation, designed for close quarters, shock combat. At Marathon, those two systems of warfare met head-on. In a move of astonishing audacity, the Athenian generals decided to attack. The hoplites locked their shields together, lowered their iron-tipped spears, and charged across the plain at a run to minimize their exposure to the Persian arrows. The impact was devastating. The heavily armored Greeks smashed into the lighter armed Persian infantry, their long spears and disciplined ranks proving unstoppable. The Persian lines broke, and the army fled in a panic back to their ships. A small, citizen army had defeated a professional force from the world's greatest superpower. It was a victory that sent a shockwave of confidence through Athens. The Persians, however, were not so easily deterred. Darius died, but his son and successor, Xerxes, spent years planning a new invasion on a scale the world had never seen. In 480 BCE, he led a colossal army and navy into Greece, a force so large that the ancient historian Herodotus claimed it drank rivers dry as it marched. This time, the Greek city-states, faced with an existential threat, managed to put aside their rivalries and form a shaky alliance, with the famously disciplined Spartans taking command of the land forces. The story of this second invasion is a legend. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, a tiny force of 300 Spartans, led by their king, Leonidas, along with a few thousand other Greek allies, held off the entire Persian army for 3 days. It was a suicidal last stand, and they were all eventually killed. But their sacrifice was not in vain. It bought precious time for the Greek allies to prepare, and more importantly, it created an immortal story of courage that inspired the Greek world to resist rather than submit. The decisive battle, however, was fought at sea. The Athenian statesman Themistocles, a brilliant strategist, lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis near Athens. In these cramped waters, the Persians' numerical advantage was nullified. Their larger, less maneuverable ships were easy prey for the smaller, faster Greek warships, the triremes, which rammed them and sent them to the bottom. The battle was a disaster for Xerxes. With his navy crippled, he could no longer properly supply his vast army. He retreated to Persia, leaving a large force behind to finish the conquest the following year. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, the largest hoplite army ever assembled, led by the Spartans, met the remaining Persian force on an open plain, and in a long and bloody battle, completely crushed them. The question that has been asked for 2.5 millennia is, why did the Greeks win? It was not simply a matter of the superiority of Greek iron spears and bronze armor against Persian wicker shields and cloth tunics, though that was certainly a factor. The deeper reason was a profound difference in ideology and motivation. The Persian army, for all its might, was an army of subjects. They fought bravely, but they fought for a king, an absolute monarch hundreds of miles away. The Greek hoplite was fighting for something entirely new to the world. He was fighting for his polis, for his home, his farm, his family, and for his right as a citizen to have a say in his own destiny. He was not a subject. He was a stakeholder. This was a war between an empire and an idea, and against all odds, the idea won. The quiet confidence of the free, iron-wielding citizen born in the small villages of the Greek Dark Age had proven itself on the world stage. The improbable victory of the small Greek city-states over the might of the Persian Empire ushered in an age of incredible confidence and creativity, particularly in Athens. This was the classical age, the time of Socrates, Plato, and the building of the Parthenon. But this golden age was not to last. The very independence and pride that had fueled their victory soon turned inward, curdling into arrogance and rivalry. The two leading cities, Democratic Athens and the militaristic oligarchy of Sparta became locked in a decades-long, ruinous struggle for dominance, known as the Peloponnesian War. It was a conflict that exhausted the Greek world, bleeding the city-states of their wealth, their manpower, and their moral certainty. By the middle of the 4th century BCE, the once proud polis system was broken, its citizen soldiers weary, the way open for a new, more ruthless power to rise in their own backyard. To the north of Greece lay the kingdom of Macedon, a rugged, mountainous land inhabited by a people the sophisticated Athenians and Spartans considered to be semi-barbaric country cousins. But under their shrewd, ambitious, and battle-scarred king, Philip II, this backward kingdom was being forged into the most advanced military power of the age. Philip had spent time as a youth as a hostage in Greece, and he had studied the Greek hoplite phalanx with a keen, analytical eye. He saw its strengths, but also its weaknesses. Upon returning to Macedon, he created a new, professional army that took the Greek model and perfected it. He armed his soldiers not with the 8-foot hoplite spear, but with the sarissa, a truly terrifying pike, some 18 feet long and tipped with a vicious iron point. When his new Macedonian phalanx leveled their pikes, they presented a bristling, impenetrable hedge of iron that was 5 spear points deep. He combined this unstoppable infantry with the finest heavy cavalry in the world, an elite corps of nobles known as the Companions. Philip's army was a perfectly balanced, combined arms force, and with it he subdued the quarreling Greek cities one by one, uniting them for the first time under a single ruler. Philip's ultimate plan was to lead a great pan-Hellenic army on a crusade of revenge against the Persian Empire. But just as his invasion was about to begin, he was assassinated, and the throne passed to his brilliant, charismatic, and barely 20-year-old son, Alexander. No one could have predicted what would happen next. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia with his father's magnificent army, and in a little over a decade of ceaseless campaigning, he effectively conquered the known world. His journey was a whirlwind of military genius. He shattered the Persian armies at the battles of the Granicus, Issus, and finally, in the decisive confrontation at Gaugamela, where his tactical brilliance completely overwhelmed the numerically vast forces of the last Persian king, Darius III's. He marched his army through Anatolia, down the Levantine coast, and into Egypt, where he was hailed as a liberator and crowned pharaoh. On the coast of the Nile Delta, he founded the first and greatest of the many cities that would bear his name, Alexandria. He then turned east again into the heart of the Persian Empire, capturing the legendary cities of Babylon, Susa, and the Achaemenid capital of Persepolis, whose magnificent palaces he later burned, a symbolic and final act of revenge for the burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. But he did not stop. Possessed by an insatiable drive, a desire he called pothos, or longing, he pushed his weary army over the treacherous Hindu Kush mountains and into the plains of India. Only there, on the banks of the Hephaestus River, did his exhausted and homesick army finally refuse to go any further. He had reached the edge of his world, but Alexander's legacy is not just one of conquest. The great historical debate is about what he intended to do with the world he had won. Was he simply a driven, power-mad warlord, or did he have a greater vision? As his campaign progressed, He began to do things that shocked his traditional Macedonian officers. He started to wear the robes of a Persian king and adopted the elaborate rituals of their court. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, culminating in a spectacular mass wedding at the city of Susa, where he and 10,000 of his troops took Persian brides in a grand gesture of cultural fusion. He founded dozens of new cities, which he populated with his Greek and Macedonian veterans alongside local people, hoping they would grow into new cosmopolitan centers. He seemed to be dreaming of a new world order, a unified empire that would blend the best of Greek and Persian civilization. He would never see it. In 323 BCE, upon his return to Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a fever and died at the age of just 32. His vast empire, held together by his personal genius, immediately began to fracture as his most powerful generals, the Diadochi or successors, fought over the spoils. They carved his conquests into a series of new kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid in the old Persian heartland, and the Antigonid in Macedon and Greece. And these kingdoms became the vessel for his true, lasting legacy. This was the beginning of the Hellenistic Age. For the next 3 centuries, a Greek-speaking elite would rule over the ancient civilizations of the Near East. Greek became the language of commerce, government, and scholarship from Italy to India. Greek art, architecture, and philosophy spread across this vast area, where it mingled and fused with the older traditions of Egypt, Babylon, and Persia. So let the final image be of a place that best symbolizes this new, blended world: the Great Library of Alexandria in Ptolemaic Egypt. Here, in a city founded by a Macedonian conqueror on ancient Egyptian soil, the world's knowledge was gathered. Scholars from every corner of this new, interconnected world, Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, Babylonians, came to study scrolls written in the Greek language on sheets of Egyptian papyrus. This was the world that Alexander's iron pikes had made, a world where armies had broken down the barriers between East and West, creating a single, vast, cosmopolitan space where ideas and cultures could meet, mix, and create the foundations for the next chapter of human history. While the successors of Alexander were ruling their vast Hellenistic kingdoms in the East, dazzling the world with the wealth of Egypt and the deep history of Persia, a very different kind of power was quietly and methodically taking shape in the West. Across the Adriatic Sea, on the Italian peninsula, the story was not one of a brilliant, mercurial conqueror, but of a single city. It was a city that had been a backwater, a city that had suffered the humiliation of being sacked and burned by Celtic invaders. But from that trauma, the city of Rome was rebuilding itself, not with the flash of genius, but with a stubborn, iron-willed determination. Over the course of 2 centuries, this one republic, through a unique combination of military innovation and political genius, would grind its many rivals into submission and unite all of Italy under its command, setting the stage for its eventual mastery of the entire Mediterranean. The sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE was a crucible. The Romans who rebuilt their city did so with a hardened resolve, a collective cultural commitment to never again be so weak and vulnerable. This resolve was channeled into an almost continuous state of warfare for the next century and a half. This was not a single grand campaign of conquest like Alexander's, but a slow, bloody, and methodical slog against their immediate neighbors. One by one, they fought and subdued the other Latin tribes of the Central Plain. They turned north and, in a series of grinding wars, finally extinguished the last embers of the once mighty Etruscan civilization, absorbing their lands and peoples. Their toughest challenge came from the mountains. In the rugged Apennine highlands lived the Samnites, fierce and independent tribes who fought the Romans in 3 brutal wars that stretched over half a century. It was here, in the difficult mountain terrain, that Rome was forced to perfect its unique military system. And finally, they turned their attention south to the wealthy and sophisticated Greek cities of Magna Graecia. These cities, in a desperate bid to maintain their independence, hired one of the most famous generals of the age, King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus brought his professional army and his Macedonian-style phalanx to Italy, and in their first encounters with this bristling wall of 18-foot pikes, the Roman armies were defeated. But the Roman spirit was relentless. Pyrrhus famously remarked after one battle, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined," giving us the term Pyrrhic victory. He had won the battle, but his losses were so great he could not sustain the campaign. The Romans, by contrast, could absorb devastating losses and simply raise a new army from their vast pool of citizen soldiers. Through sheer attrition and dogged determination, they eventually wore Pyrrhus down and forced him to abandon Italy. By 264 BCE, the entire peninsula, from the Straits of Messina to the foothills of the Alps, was under Roman control. How did this one city do it? Part of the answer lies in the evolution of their army, the Roman legion. The early Roman army had fought in a Greek-style hoplite phalanx, but in the wars against the Samnites in the mountains, they learned that this rigid formation was too inflexible. Over time, they developed a new system. The legion was broken up into smaller, more versatile tactical units called maniples. This checkerboard formation was a work of genius. It could flow over uneven ground, it could detach units to protect the flanks, and it could allow fresh troops to move to the front line. The individual legionary was a masterpiece of Iron Age military engineering. He was a citizen farmer, a man of discipline and immense physical toughness. He wore a coat of chainmail, an innovation the Romans likely borrowed from their Celtic enemies, and a simple iron helmet. He carried a large, curved, rectangular shield, the scutum, and his primary weapons were brutally effective. Instead of one long spear, he carried 2 heavy, iron-tipped javelins called pila. The tips of these javelins were designed to bend on impact, so they could not be thrown back. The legion would advance, hurl a devastating volley of these pila to disrupt and wound the enemy line, and then draw their signature weapon, the gladius. This was a short, broad, pointed iron sword designed not for elegant fencing, but for ruthlessly efficient stabbing and thrusting in the tight, brutal press of close-quarters combat. The Roman legion was a flexible, disciplined, and relentless killing machine, but their military prowess was only half the story. Rome's true secret weapon was its political wisdom. The Greek city-states had always been exclusive, jealously guarding the rights of citizenship. Rome, by contrast, used citizenship as a brilliant tool of assimilation. After defeating an enemy, they would create a web of alliances. Some conquered peoples were granted full Roman citizenship with the right to vote and hold office. Others were given a partial citizenship. Most became allies, who were required to provide soldiers for the Roman army, but were allowed to manage their own local affairs. This was a revolutionary concept. It meant that with every victory, Rome's own pool of available manpower grew larger. Former enemies became partners in the Roman enterprise, their soldiers fighting and dying in the legions alongside Roman citizens. It created a system of almost inexhaustible military recruitment that no other state could match. So let the final image be of a Roman road being built across a newly conquered valley in Italy. Legionaries, their gladius sheathed, now work with iron picks and shovels. Under the watchful eye of an engineer, they are laying a foundation of stone, creating a perfectly straight, durable highway that will connect this new territory to the heart of the Republic. The road is the perfect symbol of Rome itself, methodical, pragmatic, and built to last. It is a physical manifestation of their iron will. These roads, and the legions that marched upon them, were binding Italy together, creating a single, formidable power that was now ready to look beyond its own shores and challenge the great powers of the wider Mediterranean world. The relentless, methodical expansion of the Roman Republic had created a new, unified power in the heart of the Mediterranean. The Italian peninsula, once a patchwork of competing peoples, was now a single, disciplined entity, its vast manpower and resources directed by the iron will of the Roman Senate. Having secured Italy, the Republic began to look outwards, and as it looked north, beyond the snowy peaks of the Alps, its gaze fell upon the vast forested lands of Gaul. This was the heartland of the Latin Celts, a world as different from Rome as could be imagined. The collision of these two worlds, the Roman and the Celtic, would be the final tragic act in the story of the free Iron Age peoples of Europe. These were two societies, forged from the same metal, but with entirely different spirits. Rome was a single, unified state, a marvel of organization, law, and logistics. Its power lay in its collective discipline, its professionalizing army, and its brilliant engineering. The Celtic world of Gaul, by contrast, was a vibrant but chaotic tapestry of hundreds of independent and fiercely competitive tribes. Their strength was not in unity, but in the flamboyant courage of the individual warrior, in their masterful ironworking, which produced the finest chainmail and longswords in Europe, and in a proud, aristocratic warrior ethos. Rome was a machine built of interchangeable parts. Gaul was a wild, untamed forest, full of magnificent but separate trees. Into this world, in 58 BCE, came the Roman general Gaius Julius Caesar, a man of limitless ambition, razor-sharp intellect, and profound military genius. He arrived as the governor of the Roman provinces bordering Gaul, and saw in the disunity of the Gallic tribes an opportunity for fame, fortune, and political power. His account of the next 8 years, his commentaries on the Gallic War, is a cold, brilliant, and self-serving masterpiece of military history, and it is the primary lens through which we see this final, bloody chapter. Caesar's strategy was a masterclass in imperial divide and conquer. He expertly played the Gallic tribes against one another, allying with the Aedui to defeat the Helvetii, then turning on his former allies. He presented himself as a protector to some, a punisher to others, always exploiting the ancient jealousies and rivalries that prevented the Gauls from seeing their common danger. For years, his legions marched back and forth across Gaul, crushing rebellions, building bridges over the Rhine, even launching a brief expedition to Britain. But as the Romans tightened their grip, the Gauls finally began to realize that their only hope lay in unity. In 52 BCE, a charismatic young nobleman of the Arverni tribe rose to lead a great pan-Gallic revolt. His name was Vercingetorix. He was the first leader to persuade the proud, individualistic chieftains to put aside their differences and fight together under a single command. He understood that he could not defeat Caesar's disciplined legions in a pitched battle. Instead, he implemented a brutal but clever scorched earth strategy, convincing his own people to burn their villages, destroy their crops, and retreat before the Roman advance, hoping to starve the Roman army and break its logistical chain. The decisive confrontation came at the great hilltop fortress, or oppidum of Alesia. Here, Vercingetorix and his main army of some 80,000 warriors took their stand, awaiting a massive Gallic relief army that was gathering from all over the country. When Caesar and his legions arrived, they were faced with a formidable defensive position. A direct assault would be suicidal. So Caesar, with a stroke of audacious genius, decided to besiege the fortress. But this was to be no ordinary siege. He ordered his men to construct a massive wall of encirclement, a line of fortifications 11 miles long, complete with trenches, watchtowers, earthen ramparts, and fields of terrifyingly cruel man-traps and sharpened stakes. The Gauls were now sealed inside. Then came the news that the Gallic relief army, a colossal force, perhaps 250,000 strong, was on its way. Caesar was now in a desperate position, about to be caught between the army in the fortress and the much larger army arriving at his back. His response was almost superhuman in its ambition. He ordered his weary soldiers to build a second, even longer line of fortifications, this one facing outwards. The Roman army, outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1, was now dug in between two hostile forces, simultaneously the besieger and the besieged. The final climatic battle was a desperate, multi-day affair. From inside the fortress, Vercingetorix's men hurled themselves at the inner Roman wall, while from the outside, the huge relief army launched wave after wave of attacks against the outer wall. The air was filled with the sound of Gallic war horns, the shouts of men, and the disciplined metallic clash of the Roman legions holding their ground. For a moment, it seemed the Roman lines might break. But Caesar's engineering, the discipline of his veteran soldiers, and his own cool-headed command in the heat of the crisis held firm. The Gallic relief army was eventually repulsed and broke apart, its spirit shattered. For Vercingetorix and the starving army inside Alesia, all hope was lost. In a final tragic act of leadership, as described by Caesar, the Gallic chieftain donned his most splendid armor, mounted his horse, and rode out alone from the gates of the fortress. He circled Caesar's command post before dismounting, laying his weapons at the feet of the Roman general and surrendering himself to save his people from a general massacre. His great revolt was over. He would be taken to Rome in chains, displayed in Caesar's triumphal parade 6 years later, and then, in the cold darkness of a prison, ceremonially strangled. With his defeat, the spirit of free Gaul was broken. The vibrant, artistic, and chaotic world of the Iron Age Celts was now a Roman province. Their fierce independence had proven to be their fatal flaw, preventing them from uniting against a common enemy until it was far too late. The relentless, methodical iron discipline of the Roman state had finally conquered the fiery, individualistic spirit of the Celtic warrior. After the fall of Alesia and the tragic surrender of Vercingetorix, the Roman war machine stood triumphant on the northern shores of Gaul. The conquest was complete, and from these new coastlines, Roman generals like Julius Caesar could look out across the gray, churning waters of the Channel at the faint white cliffs of a land that lay on the very edge of their known world. This was the island of Britannia. Caesar himself had led 2 brief expeditions there in 55 and 54 BCE, not as a conqueror, but as a raider and a scout. He fought a few sharp battles, took some hostages, and was impressed by the fighting spirit of the locals before returning to Gaul. His brief forays were not a conquest, but they did something profound. They pulled this remote, misty island out of the realm of myth and into the harsh, clear light of Roman history. To the Romans, Britain was a place of mystery and strangeness. It was the last refuge of the Celtic world, part of the same great Latin culture that they had just subdued in Gaul, but with its own unique, insular, and ancient flavor. It was a damper, greener, wilder land, a world of deep forests, windswept moors, and vast, marshy fens. It was not a single unified kingdom, but a patchwork of powerful and often warring tribes, with names that still echo in the landscape: the Iceni in the east, the Brigantes in the north, the Catuvellauni in the heartlands. The most striking features of this landscape, the great monuments of the British Iron Age, were the hill forts. All across the country, but especially in the south and west, the summits of dominant hills were crowned with immense and complex earthworks. Places like Maiden Castle in Dorset were not mere forts, but colossal feats of communal engineering, their multiple rings of towering earthen ramparts and deep ditches enclosing an area the size of a small city. For centuries, historians debated their purpose. Were they purely defensive strongholds for a time of war, or were they permanent seats of tribal power, bustling with trade, craft, and religious ceremony? The truth is likely all of these things. They were the capitals, the warehouses, the sacred enclosures, and the ultimate refuges of their people. Within the shelter of these ramparts, or in scattered farmsteads across the land, the people of Iron Age Britain lived in a distinctive type of dwelling, the round house. This was a large, circular building, its walls made of woven wattle and daub, its roof a high, impressive cone of thatch supported by a ring of internal posts. At the center of the single, large room, a hearth would have burned day and night, its smoke finding its way out through the thatch. This was a communal space, shared by an entire extended family, a warm, smoky, and intimate world. This was a society of farmers and warriors. They were skilled agriculturalists, using iron-tipped plows called ards to cultivate their small, square fields of wheat and barley, and they kept herds of cattle and sheep. But their culture was dominated by a proud, aristocratic warrior ethos. One of their most distinctive features, and one that greatly impressed Caesar, was their continued use of the war chariot. While the Gauls had largely given up the chariot in favor of cavalry, it remained a weapon of high prestige among the British chieftains. Caesar describes with admiration the skill of the charioteers, who could control their horses at a full gallop on any terrain, while the warriors standing beside them would hurl a volley of iron-tipped javelins before leaping down to fight on foot, an echo of the heroic combat described in the epics of Homer. And at the spiritual and intellectual heart of this society was a class of people shrouded in even deeper mystery, the Druids. Our most detailed account comes from Caesar himself, who described them as a powerful, highly organized, and transnational priestly order with their headquarters in Britain. He wrote that they were the judges in all disputes, the teachers of the young nobility, and the keepers of all sacred knowledge. Their training, he claimed, could last for 20 years, during which they had to memorize a vast amount of sacred verse, as they believed it was forbidden to write their doctrines down. He spoke of their belief in the transmigration of souls, or reincarnation, and he told lurid, perhaps propagandistic, tales of them presiding over great human sacrifices in immense wickerwork figures. Separating Roman prejudice from reality is difficult, but the Druids were almost certainly the intellectual class of Celtic society. They were the philosophers, the theologians, the scientists, and the lawyers, all in one. Their power came from their immense memories, which held the unwritten laws, the genealogies of the kings, and the sacred stories of their people. In a world without writing, the person who holds the collective memory holds the power. They were the spiritual glue that bound this tribal world together. In the century that followed Caesar's brief visits, Britain was drawn ever closer into the Roman orbit. Trade with the new province of Gaul flourished. Roman wine, pottery, and luxury goods began to flow into the courts of the tribal kings of the southeast, who in turn grew rich and powerful, sometimes becoming client rulers, allies of Rome. The island was being slowly, subtly changed, its fierce independence being softened by the temptations of Roman commerce. Let the image that settles be of a great hill fort at dusk, the smoke from the roundhouse fires curling into the misty air. In a sacred grove of ancient oaks nearby, the white-robed druids pass on the sacred verses to their young pupils. It is a proud, ancient, and complex world, living by the rhythm of its own iron tools and timeless beliefs. But it is a world on the edge and living in its final moments of a long, misty dream. For just across the water, the eagles of the Roman legions were gathering once more, this time with the intent to stay. The final, desperate resistance of the Celtic tribes in Gaul and Britain marked the end of an era. The age of the independent, tribal Iron Age societies in Western Europe was over, brought to a close by the relentless, methodical power of Rome. In the century following Caesar's conquests, the chaotic and bloody civil wars that had torn the Roman Republic apart would also end, and a new political order would emerge under the first emperor, Augustus. This was the dawn of the Roman Empire, and with it came an unprecedented period of stability and prosperity that would last for 200 years, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a peace that was won and maintained by the most powerful, professional, and well-equipped army the world had ever seen. And this army, along with the vast civilian society it protected, was the ultimate consumer of iron. The Roman Empire did not invent new iron technology so much as it perfected its production and application on a scale that was simply staggering, becoming the true and final culmination of the Iron Age in the West. If the Assyrians had created the first military industrial complex, the Romans scaled it up to a global enterprise. The empire at its height was defended by a standing army of some 30 to 40 legions, plus an equal number of auxiliary troops, totaling nearly 500,000 soldiers stationed in forts and fortresses from the misty border of Scotland to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria. To equip and supply such a force was a logistical challenge of immense proportions, and the demand for iron was almost limitless. Every soldier needed an iron sword, the gladius, and later the longer spatha. He needed the iron heads for his heavy javelins, the pila. He needed an iron helmet, an iron shield boss, and iron fittings for his armor, whether it was the traditional chainmail or the new iconic lorica segmentata, the overlapping plated armor made famous in movies. And that was just the fighting equipment. The army also needed millions of iron nails for its forts and bridges, iron tools for its engineers, iron rims for its wagon wheels, iron chains for its prisoners, and iron collars for its slaves. To meet this insatiable demand, the Romans organized iron production with their characteristic genius for systems and scale. They conducted geological surveys of their provinces, identifying the richest sources of iron ore, the mines of Spain, the newly conquered territories in Britain, especially the Weald and the Forest of Dean, and the province of Noricum, modern Austria, which was famous for producing high-quality steel, all became centers of massive, state-supervised mining operations. These were often brutal places, worked by slaves, convicts, and prisoners of war, who labored in harsh conditions to extract the ore that was the lifeblood of the empire. From the mines, the ore was transported to vast smelting sites. The Romans did not invent the bloomery furnace, but they refined it and built them in huge batteries. In the forests of Roman Britain and Gaul, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of these industrial zones, surrounded by enormous slag heaps, some containing hundreds of thousands of tons of the glassy waste from the smelting process. To fuel these furnaces, an astronomical amount of charcoal was required. The Roman iron industry was responsible for large-scale deforestation, clearing entire ancient forests to feed its endless hunger for fuel. This was, in a very real sense, the world's first proto-industrial revolution, and it came with the world's first large-scale industrial pollution and environmental transformation. The final stage of production took place in great, state-run armories called fabricae. These were essentially weapons factories, often located near the major legionary fortresses along the frontiers of the Rhine and the Danube. Here, hundreds of blacksmiths, many of whom were soldiers themselves, worked in organized production lines, turning the iron blooms into finished, standardized weapons. They were masters of the techniques we have already explored, reliably carburizing, quenching, and tempering the blades of their swords to ensure that every legionary was armed with a weapon of consistent, deadly quality. But the Roman Iron Age was not just a military phenomenon. The peace and security of the empire created a vast, unified market, and iron became the essential, mundane material of everyday life for over 50 million people. The agricultural boom that had begun centuries earlier reached its zenith under the Romans. Iron plows, sickles, scythes, and billhooks became common tools, increasing the agricultural output needed to feed megacities like Rome, with its million inhabitants. Roman engineering, the marvel of the ancient world, was impossible without iron. When they built their great stone aqueducts, bridges, and amphitheaters like the Colosseum, they used thousands of strong iron clamps, set in lead, to hold the massive stone blocks together. Roman carpenters, working on apartment blocks or villas, used mass-produced iron nails of every shape and size. And in the home, iron was everywhere, in the kitchen knives and cooking pots, in the latches and locks on the doors, in the hinges of a chest, and the iron stylus a schoolboy would use to write on his wax tablet. Iron had completed its long journey from a rare celestial jewel to the most common and essential substance of civilization. Let the final image be of a single, simple object, a Roman hobnail, the small iron studs hammered into the sole of a legionary's sandal, his caliga. It is a profoundly unglamorous thing. But think of its journey. The iron was mined by a captive in Spain, smelted using charcoal from a felled forest in Gaul, forged by a soldier smith in a state factory in Germany, and shipped along a paved Roman road to a fort on the edge of the empire. Now, it bites into the earth of a distant land with every step the soldier takes. That small, mass-produced piece of iron is a symbol of the entire Roman system, its scale, its organization, its power, and its ability to turn the raw materials of the earth into the very fabric of a global empire. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire seemed to be the whole world. From the rain-swept walls of northern Britain to the scorching sands of Egypt, its authority was absolute, its peace guaranteed by the iron discipline of its legions. And yet, for all its might, there was one border where the Roman eagle could never fly triumphant, one frontier where its expansion was permanently and decisively checked. This was the East. Looking across the Euphrates River from their forts in Syria, Roman soldiers did not see scattered tribes or client kingdoms. They saw another superpower, a civilization as ancient and as proud as their own, an empire that was Rome's equal and its opposite in almost every way. This was the domain of the Parthians, and later the Sassanids, the great lords of Persia, and the masters of a revolutionary new form of iron warfare. The story begins with the slow decay of Alexander the Great's eastern legacy. The vast Persian territories had been ruled for a century by his Greek-speaking successors, the Seleucid kings. But in the middle of the 3rd century BCE, a new power arose from the steppes of Central Asia, on the northeastern fringe of the Iranian plateau. These were the Parthians, a semi-nomadic Iranian-speaking people, and they were brilliant horsemen. Led by their founding king, Arsaces, they swept down into the heartland of Persia, driving out the last of the Hellenistic Greek rulers and re-establishing a native Iranian dynasty. They saw themselves as the restorers of a proud tradition, the true heirs to the empire of Cyrus the Great, and for nearly 500 years they would rule an empire that stretched from Mesopotamia to the borders of India. And they fought in a way that was completely alien to the Romans. The Roman army was a masterpiece of infantry, a slow-moving, methodical grinding machine designed to take and hold ground. The Parthian army, by contrast, was an army of the horse, perfectly adapted to the vast open plains and deserts of their homeland. It was built on two revolutionary and complementary principles. The first was the horse archer. The bulk of their army was made up of lightly armored but superbly skilled archers on swift, agile mounts. They refused to meet the Roman legions in a head-on clash. Instead, they would swarm around the slow-moving Roman squares, peppering them with arrows from all sides, riding away whenever the infantry tried to charge. They perfected the tactic that would be forever associated with their name, the Parthian shot. A squadron of horse archers would pretend to flee in a panic, luring the enemy into a pursuit. Then, in a stunning display of horsemanship, they would twist around in their saddles while at a full gallop and fire a devastating volley of arrows backward into the faces of their pursuers. This was frustrating, demoralizing, and lethal, but it was their second weapon that was the true killer. This was the cataphract, the ultimate expression of heavy cavalry and the ancient world's precursor to the medieval knight. The cataphract was a living iron battering ram. The rider, a wealthy nobleman, was encased from head to foot in a suit of gleaming iron armor, either intricate scale mail or overlapping plates known as lamellar armor. Even his horse was covered in a heavy iron barding. His weapon was the contos, a massive 12-foot-long lance, which he wielded with two hands. A disciplined charge by a squadron of these iron-clad behemoths was an unstoppable force, capable of shattering any infantry line that had been softened up and thrown into disarray by the horse archers. The perfect and most terrible demonstration of this new way of war came in 53 BCE at the Battle of Carrhae. The Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, led a massive army of 7 legions deep into Parthian territory, seeking glory and conquest. In the open desert of Mesopotamia, his army was surrounded by the Parthians. For an entire agonizing day, the Roman legionaries could do nothing but lock their shields together and stand helplessly in their dense squares as the Parthian horse archers circled them endlessly, raining down arrows. When the Romans tried to advance, the Parthians would simply retreat, firing as they went. And whenever a Roman cohort broke formation, the cataphracts would charge, their heavy lances crashing through shields and men with terrifying ease. It was one of the most crushing defeats in Roman history. Crassus was killed, and the Golden Legionary Eagles were captured, a deep national humiliation. The Battle of Carrhae established the military reality that would define the next 700 years of history. Rome and the Iranian empires of the Parthians and their successors, the Sassanids, were locked in a great stalemate. They were the two superpowers of the classical world, perfectly matched and perfectly opposed. The Romans could march east and capture the great cities of Mesopotamia, but their infantry-based legions could never hold the open countryside against the fluid Parthian cavalry. The Parthians could launch deep and destructive raids into Roman Syria, but their cavalry-based armies could never successfully besiege and capture the great Roman fortified cities. They were two systems in equilibrium, the irresistible force of the cataphract meeting the immovable object of the legion. In the 3rd century CE, the somewhat decentralized Parthian dynasty was overthrown by a new, more aggressive, and centralized Persian dynasty, the Sassanids. They saw themselves as the true restorers of ancient Persian glory and continued the long struggle against Rome, and later its eastern successor, the Byzantine Empire, for another 4 centuries. They perfected the cataphract, making them even more heavily armored, and created a rich and sophisticated court culture that would be the envy of the world. Let the final image be of the 2 empires facing each other across the still water of the Euphrates River. On the western bank, a Roman sentry paces the stone rampart of a square, orderly fortress, his segmented iron armor and short sword a symbol of the disciplined infantry-based power of the West. He looks out across the river, and on the eastern bank, a Parthian cataphract, a shimmering tower of iron on an ironclad warhorse, sits motionless, his long lance pointed towards the desert sky. He is a symbol of the aristocratic, cavalry-based power of the East. The river is not just a border between 2 empires, but a frontier between 2 worlds, the 2 great rival poles of the Iron Age at its absolute zenith, locked in a long, unresolvable, and deeply respectful conflict. And so we find our story at its grand zenith, with the world neatly divided between 2 colossal, iron-wielding superpowers. In the West, the vast, orderly, and multicultural Roman Empire, a world of cities, roads, and legions. In the East, the proud, aristocratic Persian Empire of the Parthians and their Sassanid successors, a world of cavalry, trade, and ancient tradition. For centuries, these 2 giants faced each other across the Euphrates, locked in a long, respectful, and seemingly eternal struggle. This was the world that iron had built, a world of unprecedented scale, complexity, and military might. And yet, this is where the very idea of an Iron Age begins to dissolve, not in a great and sudden collapse, but in a slow and quiet transformation, fading away like the last embers of a blacksmith's forge at the end of a long day. The very concept of a historical age, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, is a tool, a label that we, in the future, place upon the past. It is most useful for understanding prehistory, for classifying societies by the primary material that shaped their lives. But as we move into periods with rich written records, our labels change. We no longer speak of the Iron Age Roman Empire. We simply call it the Roman Empire. We define it by its culture, its politics, and its people, not by the metal of its tools. The Iron Age doesn't truly end with a bang, as the Bronze Age did. Instead, it ends by becoming a total, unqualified success. Its technology becomes so fundamental, so completely integrated into the fabric of every society on Earth, that it ceases to be a defining characteristic. It is no longer a revolution. It is the simple, unspoken background of everyday life. The foundation had been so successfully laid that no one noticed it anymore. From the 3rd century CE onwards, the world that these iron-based empires had created began to undergo a series of profound changes. The Roman Empire, which had seemed so eternal, was rocked by a century of deep crisis, a cycle of endless civil wars, usurping emperors, rampant inflation, and devastating plagues that swept through its cities. In the East, the more aggressive Sassanid dynasty in Persia put renewed pressure on the Roman frontiers. At the same time, from the great cold plains of northern Europe and Central Asia, new groups of people, whom the Romans called barbarians, began to migrate in vast numbers. The Goths, The Vandals, the Franks, the Huns, they too were children of the Iron Age. Their own blacksmiths had forged the long swords and spearheads with which they challenged the might of the Roman legions. And through it all, new ideas were flowing across the old imperial roads, ideas that would ultimately prove more powerful than any army. New universal religions, most notably Christianity, spread throughout the Roman world, offering a new kind of identity and a new source of authority that was not tied to the emperor or the state. The old world of classical paganism and imperial loyalty was slowly giving way to the world of late antiquity and the Middle Ages. And so, our long journey through the night comes to a quiet close. Let your mind drift back one last time to the very beginning. Remember those desperate, scattered survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, learning to work a difficult, ugly, and inferior metal, not out of genius, but out of sheer necessity. Think of the slow, patient work of the iron plow, the tool that quietly fed a growing world and allowed new civilizations to rise. Think of the iron axe, clearing the great forests of Europe and India, literally carving new homelands out of the wilderness. And think of the iron sword, the weapon that built the terrifying Assyrian Empire, that armed the citizen soldiers of Greece and Rome, and that glittered on the armor of the Persian cataphract. Iron was a democratic metal. It armed the small as well as the great. It gave the Philistines an edge over their rivals, and it allowed the small city on the Tiber to grow into a global power. But it also allowed the very barbarians at the gates of that power to challenge it on equal terms. The journey of iron is the story of how a single, common element found in the reddish soil under our feet was transformed by human ingenuity into the very backbone of the modern world. The age itself may be gone, a convenient label in a history book, but its legacy is all around us. The technologies of carburizing, quenching, and tempering, discovered by patient craftsmen who read the language of fire and color, are the foundations of modern metallurgy. The steel that forms the silent, invisible skeleton of the building around you right now is the direct descendant of the steel forged in a Roman fabrica or an Indian crucible. The story of iron never truly ended. It simply became our story. And now, the forges are cool, the great armies are asleep, and the long tales of the past have been told. All is quiet. It is time to rest.